Chapter 456. The banquet was sumptuous, and no one could tell that Cold Shadow City was a city lacking in resources. Of course, as the lord of the city, Cheesem's life was much better than others. Even if all the citizens of the city were eating wild vegetables to fill their stomachs, Cheesem's table would still be filled with meat and fish. If power couldn't satisfy one's desires, then people wouldn't fight to the death. When Cheysam blocked Adolf, he was very rude, but in front of Han Jin, he became much more friendly. If given a choice, no one would want to make an enemy out of Han Jin. The scariest thing in the world was to face an enemy that couldn't be killed. That feeling was like a bone stuck in one's throat, making one feel uneasy. Although Cheysam had a happy smile on his face, he was very conflicted inside. It wasn't that he hadn't thought of going all the way and killing Han Jin right here and now, but after thinking it over and over again, he gave up on that idea. It was too dangerous. When Dragon City and Prudence of the Elves set up a death trap for Han Jin was still able to come out unscathed, and even took advantage of the situation to kill Maxwell. Cheysam didn't think that he had the ability to keep Han Jin alive. Furthermore, Adolf the ascetic's respect for Han Jin made his heart hang in the air. Everything had a cause, so why would a pure believer lower his proud head? Han Jin didn't sit at the same table as Cheysam, not because Cheysam was impolite, but because of his size. Cheesem's table was almost 2 meters tall, and the huge armchair was big enough for several Han Jin to sit side by side. If Cheysam insisted on letting Han Jin sit next to him, then it would be an insult to Han Jin. After eating enough, Cheysam couldn't hold it in any longer. He wiped his oily mouth and said with a smile, "Lord Raphael, I have always been a bit impatient. Let's not beat around the bush. Let's be honest, you came to my place." Cheysam didn't mention the slave merchant group from beginning to end, because it was meaningless. "I came for peace," Han Jin said with a smile. "Peace?" Cheysam rubbed his hands together. "Can you be more specific? Let's stop fighting with Depew City. There's no need for us to kill each other." Han Jin went straight to the point. He realized that his tone was a little harsh. To avoid irritating the patient, he added, "Of course, this is just my personal suggestion. Armistice with Depew City." Cheysam looked up at the ceiling of the hall and muttered to himself. No one knew what he was thinking. After a while, he chuckled and looked at Han Jin from the corner of his eyes. "If I really wanted to take down Depew City, I would only need 3 days to kill everyone in Depew City. Do you believe me?" "Oh." Han Jin was stunned for a moment, then smiled and said, "Then why did you let Molly Sen go? Could it be that you have a personal relationship with him and cannot bear to hurt him?" "Personal relationship? Who does he think he is, to talk about friendship with me?" Cheysam looked a little restless. He tore open his shirt, revealing his steel-like chest muscles. He then looked seriously at Han Jin and slowly said, "The problem is, I don't know what I should do after I take down Depew City." Han Jin was silent for a moment. He understood what Cheysam meant. After Cheysam took down Kumin City, he had successfully opened up a communication line. However, he did not take advantage of the situation to attack Depew City. He only sent out a small army to harass the city because Cold Shadow City had suffered a great loss. Furthermore, he did not understand the situation outside. Therefore, he sent out a slave merchant group to show his power, and also to test Depew City's strength. He needed a year to rest and recuperate for the next year. In the second year, when Cheysam was preparing to launch an attack during the winter, the situation had changed drastically. The Elven Alliance had been formed, and the Beastmen had joined the battle. They had the momentum to sweep across the entire continent. This made Cheysam feel a little helpless. After taking down Depew City, he would have to face the armies of the Elves and Beastmen. He did not want to show his weakness in front of the enemy. Therefore, although Cheysam had launched the war according to his own plan, he did not fight resolutely. He did not even send out his main forces. Otherwise, Chasem would not have said what he did. Actually, after the elves and I annihilated the Beastmen army, we also thought of attacking Depew City, Han Jin said with a smile. Oh? Then why didn't you send out your troops? Is it because you have a personal relationship with Malishan? Chasem asked with a smile. No. Han Jin said faintly, I have the same concerns as you. After taking down Depew City, what should I do? Chasem was stunned for a moment, and then burst into laughter. He laughed so hard that he rocked back and forth and even cried. Then he raised a large glass of wine, signaled to Han Jin, and drank it up. Han Jin's meaning was obvious. He admitted that Chasem was a powerful opponent, so he did not want to attack Depew City, lest he face Chasem directly. This was a form of respect from the enemy. Of course, it was more precious than the respect from his clansmen and ice mages. Chasem was very satisfied and happy. He felt that Han Jin was much more pleasing to the eye than when they first met. To be honest, Lord Raphael, I thought that your holy crown city would only last half a month at most, and then it would be conquered by the allied forces of the elves and the beastmen. But I didn't expect. Chasem sighed, you are the final victor. Haha. I have to thank the beastmen. They regarded the elves as their enemy from the very beginning. They didn't take me seriously at all and gave me a winter to grow stronger, Han Jin said with a smile. I'm still very young, and I don't lack anything except time. Chasem couldn't smile anymore. If Han Jin could become so powerful in one winter, then what would happen in a few years? And now Han Jin was already a demigod. What would happen in the future? Han Jin's words didn't sound threatening at all, but Chasem felt a great sense of crisis. His silver eyes flickered, obviously thinking about something. You should ask me why I said, let's not kill each other. Han Jin calmly changed the topic. This is the real reason why I came to fight for peace. Why? Chasem asked. Because the Abyss World is about to launch an invasion, Han Jin said slowly. What did you say? Chasem was stunned for a moment, and then he almost jumped up and asked sharply. I said, the Second World War is about to break out, Han Jin said. Chasem's body turned into a stone statue, and he stared blankly at Han Jin. The surrounding titans and dozens of ice mages were also stunned. The atmosphere became deadly silent. This is a war where there will be no compromises. All the races on the surface must abandon their prejudices and unite to fight against the Abyss World. Otherwise, what awaits us will be complete annihilation. Han Jin said slowly, of course, this is also a glorious war, a war that tests the will of the people and humanity. Some of us may become heroes who save the world, and some of us may become cowards who are laughed at by others. No matter what, we have no way out. Either we make the Abyss World go back underground, or we, Lord Raphael, where did you get this information? Is it accurate? Chasem suddenly cut off Han Jin's words. Do you think I came here just to tell a joke? Han Jin asked. Why is it happening now? I've heard that the Abyss World has always been in chaos. Where did they get the strength to launch an invasion? We don't seem to be that strong. His name is Donald. Although he hasn't unified the Abyss World, his influence is unimaginable. At the very least, he can form an alliance and summon all the abyssal races to join this war. Han Jin smiled and continued, your information is outdated. His name is Donald. Although he hasn't unified the Abyss World, his influence is unimaginable. At the very least, he can form an alliance and summon all the abyssal races to join the war. Donald? World leader? Chasem also understood the ancient Elven language. This name sounded very funny, but Chasem didn't want to laugh, nor could he laugh. Han Jin was right. The strength of the surface races was at its lowest because of the years of chaos. Lord Raphael, you know the Abyss World very well? Yes. Han Jin nodded. In Donald's original plan, he didn't want to start a war so soon. Why did he change his plan? Chasem hurriedly asked. Because of the church. Han Jin whispered. No one can deny that the Church can play a decisive role in the war against the Abyss World. Sadly, Nicholas launched a war against the Church. He joined forces with the Dragon Field and launched a large-scale attack on the Rising Sun Mountains. Countless followers of the Church were killed. As you know, the Church has moved to my holy crown city. Now there are only a few hundred Knights of Light left, and only a dozen cardinals left in the priest group. If you were Donald, would you let go of this opportunity? Adolf's eyes were filled with sorrow. What he wanted to do most was not to go to the Holy Crown City to reorganize the Church, but to go to the southwest and make Nicholas pay the price. However, he couldn't avoid the responsibility of being an ascetic. Compared with the future of the Church, revenge was secondary. He couldn't let the seed of faith be extinguished. No. Chisholm's gaze fell on Adolf. He didn't like followers at all. He wanted to take the opportunity to mock Adolf, but when he thought about the war in the future, he didn't have the mood to gloat at all. So, the war is really going to break out soon? Yes. Han Jin nodded. Perhaps they are hiding underground right now. When Han Jin said this, he didn't expect his words to come true. I heard that the Abyss is a hot and stuffy world. I want to know how they are going to fight against us Titans on the ice field, Chasem said with a smile. At this moment, he had already calmed down. He was telling Han Jin that he wasn't afraid, he was afraid of them. In the early and middle stages of the war, the Abyss world wouldn't have any ideas about Cold Shadow City. This is a war between worlds. No life can stay out of it, Han Jin said calmly. Is the ice field really your shield? I remember that a long, long time ago, the holy land of the Titans was Cloudtop City, located at the peak of a snowy mountain. That was also the golden age of the Titans. What happened in the end? Haha. Cloudtop City turned into ruins, and the endless snowy mountain turned into a burning hell. Chisholm's expression changed greatly. He stood up abruptly, the silver light in his eyes growing brighter and brighter. From this angle, Han Jin knew that Chasem was staring at him, or rather, was glaring at him. Everyone had their own pain, and it was the same for every race. The Battle of Cloudtop City was an untouchable wound for all Titans. The Battle of Cloudtop City was also the watershed that marked the fall of the Titans from their glory days. I didn't mean to offend you. I just wanted to tell you that since Donald is deliberately starting a war between worlds, Black Dragon Valentine will also lead his Black Dragon clan into the war. Han Jin's tone was still indifferent, as if he didn't care about Chisholm's anger. The ice field won't be able to stop those black dragons. Chasem took a deep breath and slowly sat back down. He tried his best to control his desire to be angry. The Titans around Chasem were all trembling slightly. It wasn't because of fear, but because of hatred, a hatred that had been accumulating for countless years. Black dragons and Titans were mortal enemies, just like angels and demons. No matter when or where they met, a battle would immediately break out between them. The Titans had enough reasons to hate the Dark Dragons. It was the Dark Dragons who had destroyed the pride of the Titans, Cloudtop City. Countless clansmen had fallen to the Dark Dragon's breath, and the Dark Dragons also had enough reasons to hate the Titans. If the Titans had not been arrogant and had repeatedly offended Lord Valentine to the point where he could no longer tolerate them, how could the Dark Dragons have fallen to such a state? In reality, the Black Dragons held the greatest authority in the original unified Dragon Clan. They were born with absolute immunity to magic, and their strength surpassed that of gold dragons of the same level. Gold dragons would be hurt by forbidden spells, but black dragons could ignore all magic. In other words, if a gold dragon and a black dragon fought, the gold dragon could only use its claws to hurt its opponent, while the black dragon could use magic against the gold dragon. This was a completely unequal battle. It was precisely because the black dragons had suffered so many casualties in the Battle of Cloudtop City that the gold dragons took advantage of this opportunity. Right after the Battle of Cloudtop City ended, the gold dragons suddenly turned hostile. As a result, not only did the black dragons lose their right to speak, they were also chased underground. Although the continent wasn't small, there was no place for them to stand. Valentine, huh? Chasem muttered to himself in a daze. Since you're so straightforward, I'll be honest with you. Han Jin smiled. It's impossible for you to avoid a war and preserve your strength. I'm here because I sincerely want to form an alliance with you. It's too late today, Lord Raphael. Chasem came back to his senses and forced a smile. Give me some time to think about it. I'll give you an answer tomorrow. Then it's settled. Tomorrow? Han Jin said slowly. I can't keep waiting here, because the war might break out tomorrow. I understand. Chisem's tone was very depressed. Just like that, the banquet ended abruptly. Although the rooms in the castle were very large, there were still rooms suitable for Han Jin to rest in. A few ice mages respectfully led Han Jin to a room. Adolf's room was arranged next to Han Jin's. After finding a few maids to serve him, he politely excused himself. Han Jin sat on a chair, quietly thinking about today's gains and losses, as well as the possibility of forming an alliance the next day. Adolf didn't return to his room to rest. In fact, he didn't need to rest. He silently followed beside Han Jin the entire time. Han Jin didn't have much to worry about, but Harley didn't have a chance to show his face. He didn't dare to show his face either. At this moment, he was constantly cursing Adolf in his heart. My lord, do you think Chasem will form an alliance with you? Adolf asked softly after an unknown amount of time. I'm 60 to 70% confident, but the most important thing is tomorrow. Han Jin said. Haha. I can understand Chisem's feelings. His feelings? When the Titans were at their strongest, the other weaker races all tried to obtain their protection. In other words, the Titans didn't even need to do anything themselves. They only needed to say the word, and people would rush to deliver it to them. Han Jin smiled. But now? They're trapped in Cold Shadow City, and they still have to fight for survival resources with the humans. Haha. Thinking about today's hardships, and thinking about yesterday's triumph, the Titans' hatred for the Black Dragons must have reached its peak, right? My lord, you're a little. Adolf could tell that Han Jin was taking pleasure in his misfortune. This didn't match his feelings. After all, taking pleasure in others' misfortune was a human emotion. What's wrong with me? Han Jin asked with a smile. Nothing. Adolf didn't know what to say, so he could only avoid the topic. Unlike Jed's, he would lie when he needed to. Han Jin frowned slightly. Using the Battle of Cloud Top City to provoke Chasem should have achieved his goal. Even if Chasem still wanted to take advantage of the situation and preserve his strength, the other Titans wouldn't agree. If Chasem forced the Titans to stay out of the battle, it would definitely damage his personal prestige, and might even cause internal strife. Of course, forming an alliance was only the first step. The most important thing was what kind of alliance was formed. A so-called alliance needed a leader. Otherwise, if everyone did whatever they wanted, what was the point of an alliance? In this aspect, Chasem wouldn't give in easily. This was the contradiction. Han Jin wanted to control the alliance, and Chasem wanted the same. Even if he knew that he was inferior, he still wanted to retain absolute autonomy. Han Jin pondered for a long time. He felt waves of restlessness coming from the soul-devouring orb. Harley wanted to say something, but didn't dare to come out. Only then did he realize Adolf's existence. He raised his head and said, "Your Excellency Adolf, it's getting late. You should go back and rest." "Yes, my lord," Adolf responded and slowly walked out of the room. After he gently closed the door, he didn't leave. He stood straight outside. He was indeed preparing to rest. Just like before, he could fall asleep standing up. Chapter 457. The moment the door closed, Harley couldn't hold it in any longer. He immediately turned into a cloud of smoke and whispered into Han Jin's ear, "Master, Master, did you notice?" Harley's voice trembled slightly. He was obviously extremely excited. "What did you notice?" Han Jin asked. "Chisam's shield. That golden shield." Han Jin thought for a moment and nodded. "I remember." "You remember?" When Harley saw that Han Jin's expression was still calm, he anxiously scratched his ears and cheeks. Of course, this was just his subconscious action. He had already become a half-illusory and half-real existence. He had long lost his ears. "Master, are you serious? You don't even know about the Guardian Shield." "The Guardian Shield? You mean the Guardian Shield of the Titans?" Han Jin's expression changed in horror. "Yes, that's the Guardian Shield." Seeing that Han Jin's expression had finally changed, Harley said proudly. Surprising Han Jin was the most satisfying thing in the world. "But why can't I sense the fluctuations of the lightning element?" Han Jin asked. "Chasem must have used some sort of method to seal the Guardian God's shield." Harley became more and more proud. "However, he can't change the shape and engravings of the Guardian Shield. Haha, you've seen the Guardian Shield before?" Harley's laughter stopped abruptly. He was stunned for a moment and muttered to himself, "Yes, when did I see it? I heard from Yelena that the Titans lost their Titan armors a long time ago, right?" Han Jin frowned and pondered. "He can actually find the Guardian Shield. It seems that he has some ability." "Master, it's not just the Guardian Shield." Harley suddenly became alert. "Did you notice that Chasem has a sword on his waist? Compared to his body size, the sword is a bit small. Also, the other Titans don't have weapons." "You mean that sword is?" Han Jin's expression was very strange. "That's right." Harley cried out. "Also, Master, when Chasem took off his helmet, one of the maids was serving the dishes. She almost fell off the shelf to avoid the helmet." "Master, it must be because Chasem doesn't allow anyone to touch his helmet. That's why the maid was so scared." Han Jin's expression changed once more. He remembered that little episode. Chisam's maids were all humans. Because the table was too high, the maids had to walk up the rack to serve Chasem. Furthermore, the plates were ridiculously large, so the maids had to work very hard. One of the maids carefully walked up the wooden rack with the plate. Just as she was about to place the plate on the corner of the table, Chasem placed the helmet there first. The maid dodged in such a hurry that she almost fell off the rack. "Harley, when did your observation skills become so meticulous?" Han Jin asked slowly. "Haha, Master, I've always been this smart." Harley cried out proudly. In fact, Harley only remembered the Guardian's Shield. After discovering the Guardian's Shield, he naturally focused his attention on the other set. To Han Jin, this episode was meaningless, but Harley saw many things worth paying attention to. "So, Chasem has the Titan armor?" Han Jin's eyes flickered. "But Yelena told me that the Titan armor is already." "I understand." "Master, what do you understand?" Harley asked curiously. "Aren't you very smart?" "Think about it yourself, don't ask me," Han Jin said lightly. "This, Master, I can only be considered the second smartest person in the world." "You are the smartest person," Harley hurriedly flattered. "Are you worthy?" Han Jin glanced at Harley. Harley murmured. Although he wanted to tell Han Jin that he was really smart, Han Jin's gaze was full of killing intent, so he didn't dare to say anything. After waiting for a long time and seeing that Han Jin was silent, he finally couldn't help but ask softly, "Master, just now, what did you understand?" The news that the Titan armor was lost was deliberately released by the Titan race. Why would they do that? Harley was even more confused. "You dare to say that you are smart with this little brain?" Han Jin smiled and shook his head. In the Battle of Cloud Top City, even the Dark Dragon clan, as the victors, suffered heavy losses. As for the Titan clan, needless to say, at that time, the Titan clan was already powerless to protect themselves. In order to prevent other powerful clans from coveting the guardian artifact of the Titan clan, they had no choice but to do so. So that's how it is. Harley suddenly understood, and then hurriedly added, Master is indeed the smartest. Han Jin ignored Harley's flattery and pretended not to hear it. I've always been curious. Adolf's strength has long since surpassed level 12, and he is a true demigod. Why would Chasem dare to deliberately anger Adolf? So, the Titan armor is the source of his confidence. In front of you, Chasem is much more obedient. At least he knows his place. Harley was determined to continue flattering to the end. There should be a good show tomorrow. Han Jin smiled. I hope he doesn't go too far. Chasem, who had the Titan armor, would definitely not be willing to be under someone else. At the very least, he would strive for an equal position with Han Jin. However, in this way the alliance would have no meaning. If an army had two commanders, it would definitely be chaotic, and so would an alliance. The night passed uneventfully, and the next morning, a maid came to deliver breakfast. Due to the lack of resources for many years, the people of Cold Shadow City had developed their own routines. Breakfast and lunch were very simple, and only dinner would be prepared according to the individual's situation. Although Han Jin was a distinguished guest, the breakfast that the maids delivered was only a round biscuit made with vine bean powder and 2 eggs, which was somewhat shabby. After breakfast, Chasem sent a Titan to pick up Han Jin. He said that Chasem would personally lead the Magic Legion of Cold Shadow City for a drill, and hoped that Han Jin could be present to point out the shortcomings of the Magic Legion of Cold Shadow City. Han Jin knew that this was not a military drill. Chasem must have mobilized the most elite mages of Cold Shadow City to demonstrate the power of the Magic Legion. He was using this method to make Han Jin take a step back. However, Chisem's request was exactly what he wanted. He couldn't show off his magical powers while eating, as it would give people a sense of deterrence. It would be reasonable to find an excuse while watching the drill. When the sun peeked out from the mountains in the distance, Han Jin had already arrived at the military camp about 40 miles away from Cold Shadow City. Although it was called a military camp, it was actually an open-air storage room. Since most of the mages of the Magic Legion lived in the city, the soldiers here were all stone puppets and steel puppets, as well as stone monsters that had turned into statues. Chasem personally came out of the military camp to welcome him. The moment he saw Chasem, Han Jin couldn't help but glance at Chisem's shield, helmet, heavy armor, and the longsword at his waist. In the Age of Gods, the Titan armor was far less powerful than the Sacred armor and the Dragon God armor, but it was still the third most powerful divine weapon combination. Of course, Han Jin would be interested in it. Chisem's movements clearly paused, probably because he noticed Han Jin's gaze. However, no one could see the change in his emotions. His pair of silver eyes were enough to hide the fluctuations in his heart. This was also what troubled Han Jin the most. He couldn't read people's expressions, but Chasem could. Lord Raphael, how was your rest last night? Chasem smiled. Not bad. The nights in Cold Shadow City are very quiet. Han Jin also smiled. It sounded like nonsense. Most cities were very quiet at night. However, if one thought deeper, Han Jin seemed to be mocking Cold Shadow City for being quiet. Or rather, Han Jin was hinting to Chasem that with the small population of Cold Shadow City, he wouldn't dare to fight with him. I shouldn't have troubled you. Chasem chuckled. It wasn't clear if he was pretending to be confused or if he really didn't understand. But you know the abyssal races very well. I think you can give me some good advice. Please. In reality, Chasem had already set everything up. Once Han Jin arrived, the drill would immediately begin. Following the sound of the horn, groups of stone and steel golems marched into the distance in an orderly manner. The stone golems that had turned into statues had also regained their vitality, spreading their wings and flying into the sky. Stone golems are only low-level golems. They have low combat power, but they have good magic resistance. Once they reach a certain number, they can be a huge headache for mages. However, when faced with a real warrior, stone golems become extremely fragile. After all, they are made of stone. Chesam explained as he led the way. However, the good thing is that there are abundant resources. In this snowy mountain, there are plenty of stones. Lord Raphael, do you know how many stone golems Cold Shadow City had at its peak? 100,000. In order to make Chesam happier, Han Jin purposely said a small number. He also knew that Chesam had already decided to form an alliance with him since he had introduced the specialties of all kinds of puppets to him. The final question was how to form the alliance. No, it's more than 900,000. Chesam laughed. I lost more than 600,000 stone golems in the most important battle to take down Komen City. But they lost more than 100,000 soldiers. The most common warlock in Cold Shadow City can make at least 5 stone golems a day. However, if they want to train a new warrior or mage, it's not easy. They'll have to wait at least 20 years, right? How many stone golems can Cold Shadow City make every day? They can't just make stone golems. Those things don't have much use. Chesam purposely changed the topic and pointed forward. Steel golems are the most important shields for ice mages. Their magic defense is very strong, and they can even withstand the high temperature of hellfire. Their physical defense is also not to be underestimated. Even if a high-level warrior attacks with all his strength, he won't be able to leave a mark on them. Unfortunately, Cold Shadow City doesn't have any iron ore. Making a single steel golem requires more than 10,000 pounds of iron ore. Sigh. Chesam let out a long sigh. There are a total of 5 iron ore mines in Holy Crown City. Don't worry, I can provide the resources for that. Han Jin smiled. He knew that Chesam was pretending to be poor. Good. Chesam laughed again. You're as straightforward as I am. At this moment, countless gargoyles flew in from all directions and gathered with the gargoyles hovering in the air. The scene of thousands of birds flying into the forest was already very spectacular. More than 100,000 gargoyles gathered together and hovered in the air, forming a dark cloud that covered the sky. The puppet army, the military camp, and the mountains in the distance were all shrouded in shadow. Chesam looked up and said, Gargoyles may not be as powerful as stone puppets, but they are still good for harassing, especially when it comes to harassing the enemy's magic legion. I would be more than willing to trade 1,000 gargoyles for a single mage. I can also be used for scouting. No enemy's movements within a radius of a few hundred miles can escape my notice. As they talked, they arrived at a small hill. Chesam had already prepared 2 tables with some fruits, wine, and dishes. Chesam moved aside and smiled. Please, Mr. Raphael. Isn't breakfast a bit too simple for you? Sorry, it's my fault. Come, let's talk while we drink. One of the tables was tall, while the other was relatively small. It was impossible to sit on the wrong table. Han Jin slowly sat down, while Adolf stood beside Han Jin. Although a chair was also prepared for him, Han Jin turned a blind eye to it. I heard that your mountain army is made up of warriors from Komen City? Chesam suddenly asked. Yes. How's Alexander doing? You still remember him? Han Jin was surprised. How can I not remember? Chesam clenched his right hand into a fist and hit his left palm lightly. He sighed and said, That guy is a good general. I wanted to force him to surrender, but the war with Komen City has been going on for too long, and the hatred between us is too deep. I can't change his mind. I know what you're worried about. I'll restrain him. He won't bring us any trouble. Han Jin smiled. Oh, and to be honest, I didn't have a good impression of you. The ring of restraint you created is a bit too vicious. Vicious? I don't think so, Chesam said casually. I heard that when the elves attacked Holy Crown City, tens of thousands of elves were captured. Their tendons were cut off. Compared to you, I'm very merciful. Alas, I just like to tell the truth. I can't control myself. Haha. You're not angry, are you? That's Dismark's doing, Han Jin said lightly. There were too many captives. I couldn't do anything about it, Chasem said. I had to split my attention to watch over them. Why not kill them all back then? Now we need to. I understand. The abyssal race is about to invade. We need to unite. Chasem laughed. That's all in the past. While they were chatting, the ice mages and tens of thousands of stone and iron golems had already walked far away. They were about 50 miles away from the army camp. The dark cloud formed by countless stone golems also floated over. Finally, they could see the sun. It was almost noon. Han Jin didn't expect to wait this long. However, seeing how serious Chasem was, he would definitely show the sharpest side of Cold Shadow City's Magic Legion. Otherwise, Han Jin wouldn't have taken the initiative to back down. His expression remained calm, but his heart was filled with anticipation. The strength of his allies would, of course, help him. Chasem waved his hand, and the ice mages behind him immediately released a signal. A faint wave of mana spread out, and Chisem's army was already very far away. From where they were, they could only see a small black dot. After a short moment, they couldn't even see the black dot anymore. The distance had already been covered by a thick fog. The temperature of the air suddenly dropped. Even the sunlight became cold. Frost appeared on the plates and wine glasses on the table. A few maids couldn't resist the cold and quietly put on their leather robes. However, everyone else maintained their indifferent expressions. Of course, Han Jin wasn't afraid of this kind of cold. Ice mages were used to dealing with ice and snow all year round, so they weren't afraid of it either. The power of a blizzard cast by a single mage was limited. However, when thousands of ice mages cast a blizzard at the same time, the power was unimaginable. Moreover, the ice mages were constantly using up their magic. After half an hour, the sound of wind and thunder could be heard. The fog finally began to move forward. Two ice mages hurriedly walked forward and activated X-ray eyes for Han Jin and Chasem. The dancing snowflakes gathered together to form snowflakes of various sizes. Finally, they formed a torrent that was more than 10 kilometers wide. The torrent surged forward with great momentum. From the X-ray eyes, one could clearly see that the tip of the torrent was more than 100 meters tall. Within the torrent of snow, countless stone and steel puppets were sprinting forward. The figures of ice mages could be seen flickering in and out of the torrent of snow. Whether it was the puppets or the ice mages, they didn't seem to be affected by the blizzard. Seeing this scene, a word flashed through Han Jin's mind. Avalanche. The sound of wind and thunder grew louder and louder, and the temperature dropped lower and lower. A few of the most fragile maids had frost on the tip of their noses, lips, and hair. Their bodies were also trembling from the cold. On the other hand, the ice mages still maintained their calm. In fact, they were wearing very thin clothing. Apart from a magic robe, they were only wearing underwear. The speed of the torrent of snow was also gradually increasing. It took the ice mages half a day to reach it. Now, only a few moments had passed, and the torrent of snow had already covered a third of the distance. This speed was truly shocking. What was even more shocking was that the stone and steel puppets were hidden within the torrent of snow. How could they run so fast? There wasn't much of a difference between them and the silver Pegasi of the elves. Sorry, I had some things to take care of today, so I updated late. I'll be more careful tomorrow. Chapter 458. What do you think? Isn't it spectacular? Chasem said with a chuckle. He then raised his glass, only to realize that the wine had already solidified. He threw the glass to the ground and yelled, "Get those kids to work harder!" The ice mage beside Chasem immediately released a signal. He then turned around and happened to see that the maids' faces had turned blue from the cold. He hesitated for a moment, then released a magic barrier to cover the maids. The maids obviously knew that the ice mage was helping them, and they hurriedly smiled stiffly but gratefully. This was an accident. The Magic Legion of Cold Shadow City often carried out drills and dealt with ice and snow all year round, so the mages had long since gotten used to the cold. However, because of Han Jin, Chaesam had specially called a few maids over to serve him. Although they had good physiques, the current temperature was even lower than the coldest season of winter. They really couldn't stand it. However, Chaesam didn't have the time to care about their lives. All of his attention was focused on Han Jin. The ice mage took a few steps back and felt a gaze from the side. He raised his head and saw Han Jin nodding at him with a smile of approval. The mage's heart skipped a beat, and he hurriedly lowered his head. Seeing the magic signal, the ice mages in the distance worked even harder. The surging waves of snow became faster and faster, and at the tip of the waves, a cloud of snow rose hundreds of meters into the air. From afar, it looked like a huge, snake-like snow beast was roaring as it charged forward. "No one can resist my blizzard," Chaesam said with a grin. "Don't even talk about fighting ice mages in a blizzard. It's already very difficult for them to ensure that they don't freeze." After saying that, Chaesam looked at Han Jin very seriously. He originally thought that Han Jin would be affected by the cold and would at least release a magic barrier to protect himself. Who knew that Han Jin hadn't moved at all from the beginning to the end, which surprised him. This kind of huge impact is indeed very scary. Han Jin nodded. In the blink of an eye, that incomparably huge snow beast had already covered nearly half the distance. In just a moment, it would sweep across the plains in front of them. The rumbling of wind and thunder grew more and more intense. Han Jin was fine, but the maids had just escaped the torment of the bitter cold. Now, they had to cover their ears with their hands, their faces showing signs of pain. "Lord Raphael, don't blame me for not warning you." Chaesam shook his head and said, "When the blizzard approaches, the freezing air will become colder and colder. Even these things will start to crack. You should prepare them first." Chaesam pointed at the tableware on the table. "Since you've made it sound so powerful, I would like to give it a try." Han Jin smiled. He had to give it a try. Otherwise, he would have wasted 7 or 8 days of effort. No one would be willing to give up just like that. Moreover, Chaesam was the one who provoked him first, so he had ample reason to act. "Give it a try?" Chaesam was stunned. He then smiled and said, "Lord Raphael, that's not very good. What if those guys don't know the severity of the situation and there are casualties? What should we do?" In fact, Chaesam knew that if there were casualties, it would be Han Jin accidentally killing a few ice mages. However, he couldn't say this out loud. If he did, it would be because he didn't want Han Jin to get hurt. "Don't worry, I know what I'm doing." Han Jin slowly stood up and looked around, as if he was looking for something. Chaesam still wanted to stop him, but he rolled his eyes and shut his mouth. As the saying goes, seeing is believing. Han Jin was rumored to be so powerful that he had no choice but to believe it. He wanted to see for himself what kind of magical power Han Jin possessed. Adolf's eyes flashed. He was even more interested than Chaesam. Whether his judgment was accurate or not, he still needed a clear proof, power. Harley, on the other hand, was laughing madly in his mind. "A bunch of idiots, you actually forced Master to make a move. Just you wait and tremble in fear at the miracle." Han Jin's gaze swept across the mountain range and finally past Cold Shadow City, landing on a snowy peak. He then smiled. Obviously, he had already chosen his target. Adolf, Chaesam, and the others had been paying attention to Han Jin's gaze all this time. They couldn't help but look at the snowy peak in the distance. With their eyesight and experience, they couldn't see what the snowy peak had to do with the current exercise. Han Jin took a deep breath and then began to cast a spell. He was casting a divine ability, which was completely different from the spells he had cast in the past. To be precise, divine abilities were the means of immortals. Therefore, even though he had been preparing for 7 or 8 days, he still had to give it his all. An extremely thin golden light lit up on the snowy peak. Adolf, Chasam, and the others had a strange feeling in their hearts. Even though it was so far away, that extremely thin light was so clear that it stung their eyes like a needle. This kind of brightness was unimaginable. Han Jin's spell became faster and faster. Following his hand gestures, more and more dots appeared on the snowy peak. Dozens of dots, hundreds of dots, tens of thousands of dots, and finally, the entire snowy peak had turned into a golden mountain. The dazzling light spread for almost 100 miles and even illuminated the entire military camp. The haze formed by the snow mist was completely dispelled by the light. Although they had never seen anything like this before, Adolf, Chasam, and the ice mages were still able to maintain their calm. It didn't matter if the light was a few times brighter. In terms of power, they only needed to see Han Jin's power. Open! Han Jin let out a thunderous roar. Then, he slowly reached out his left hand, as if he was holding something in the air. His movements were extremely slow, giving off a feeling that it was extremely difficult, as if the thing in his hand weighed thousands of pounds. At this moment everyone was dumbfounded. Something that could only be described as absurd happened right before their eyes. The snowy peak actually floated up into the air. Adolf had turned into a statue, Chesam's mouth was wide open, and the ice mage's eyes were wide open, as if their eyes would pop out of their sockets in the next moment. Even the maids had completely forgotten about the pressure caused by the wind and thunder, and were staring blankly at the snowy mountain that was emitting a brilliant light. Cold Shadow City was already in chaos. The people in the city were closer so they could see more clearly. When the snowy peak emitted a golden light, it had already attracted the attention of many passers-by. On top of the central castle, dozens of tall figures appeared, pointing at the snowy peak that had changed greatly. Unexpectedly, not long after, the snowy peak actually floated up into the air and flew towards Cold Shadow City. Strictly speaking, the snowy peak wasn't too big. Its height and the diameter of its base were no more than 1,000 meters. Even if it crashed into Cold Shadow City, it would only be able to destroy a part of the city. However, no one could remain calm at this moment. From a bird's-eye view, Cold Shadow City had turned into a giant ant's nest. Countless black dots rushed out from both sides of the city and made way for the snowy peak. The patrols couldn't be bothered to check the security, and the merchants couldn't be bothered to do business. Even in the bars, many people were running out with their pants up. There were also some bar girls with disheveled clothes, and a few of them were even naked. However, the people who were running for their lives didn't care about taking advantage of the situation. Everyone acted as if they didn't see anything. Of course, there were still people in charge. The mage towers in Cold Shadow City were all activated, and the dozens of titans on top of the central castle didn't run away either. They were arguing in fear. Some wanted to attack, while others tried their best to stop their companions from acting rashly. Without Chasam, Cold Shadow City had turned into a pile of loose sand. This also proved how much Chasam desired power. Near the military camp, Adolf, Chasam, and the ice mages had all turned into statues. The only parts of their bodies that could move were their eyes, which slowly rotated as the snowy peak drifted. Han Jin flipped his palm and pressed downwards. The snowy peak's drifting speed suddenly increased, and it directly rushed towards the roaring snow beast in the distance. If the snowy peak crashed into the snow wave, it would be enough to crush all the puppets and ice mages underground. However, because the scene was too shocking, Chasam completely forgot to ask Han Jin to stop the spell. He just stared blankly at the snowy peak. The snow beast that looked incomparably huge just now was completely outshone by the snowy peak. When the distance between the two sides was less than 5 kilometers, the snowy peak suddenly fell. This was Han Jin's test. He wanted to use the snowy peak to test the impact of the blizzard. The moment the snowy peak sank into the ground, the whole world suddenly became deathly silent. It was an absolute silence, as if time had stopped at this moment. Then, everything that had been suppressed suddenly exploded. The vast field had turned into a carpet, and it was a carpet that was trembling. A circular ripple spread out in all directions with the snowy peak as the center. The ripple's shape was very neat, but it clearly contained a huge amount of power. When the ripple swept across the military camp, the outer walls and wooden fences were instantly destroyed. The 2 rows of barracks for the ice mages also collapsed in the blink of an eye. The table next to Chesam jumped up, and a plate of soy sauce duck slammed into Chesam's face. Fortunately, the soy sauce duck had also been frozen. Otherwise, Chesam would have been in a very sorry state. The ice mages were all thrown out by the trembling ground, and the maids were even worse off. They flew up and crashed into the magic barrier, then fell to the ground again. Before they could struggle to get up, a second ripple swept past their feet, and their bodies were thrown up again. Then, a third ripple, and finally they fell unconscious. The snow beasts that were relatively close to the snowy peak had already been scattered by the shockwave. One could clearly see that the tall puppets had all been turned into toys. They were thrown more than 10 meters high, waving their arms and legs as they fell to the ground. Then, they were thrown back up again. The steel puppets were still fine, but a small number of stone puppets had been thrown back several times. They had already become disabled, either losing their legs or arms. The shockwave even had a huge impact on Cold Shadow City, which was dozens of kilometers away. The magic barrier released by the Mage Tower was constantly distorted by the shockwave, and those who were smart enough to escape the city were also unlucky. One by one, they fell to the ground. Just as they got up, the second ripple had already reached them, and they couldn't help but fall again. This scene was too terrifying, as if the end of the world had arrived. Cries and screams filled the air. However, the shockwave was only a small interlude. The real shockwave soon formed, and countless gravel and stones were all thrown into the air. The largest stone was actually several times the size of a fist. Then, a ferocious storm surged in all directions. Bang! Everyone finally heard a bang that was practically capable of tearing their eardrums apart. The sound was extremely oppressive, and it clearly contained a type of peerlessly enormous pressure that pressed down on them to the point they felt dizzy and uncomfortable, as if a 5,000 kilograms boulder was pressing down on their chests, and it was even to the extent they felt as if they were about to spit blood. The storm that carried countless gravel and stones had arrived. Fortunately, the ice mages had recovered some of their consciousness, and they all cast magic barriers around themselves. The ice mage who had helped the maids directly rushed in and covered himself, and the maids who were lying unconscious on the ground with a magic barrier. Chesam's large table had already been flipped over, and it was then swept up by the storm. Countless gravel and stones hit the table, and soon, the table was shattered into pieces. The ice mages knew that this was a moment of life and death, and they desperately tried to maintain their magic barriers. However, they were unable to control their bodies, and they flew and spun in the air like powerless kites. The collapsed barracks, broken walls, and all kinds of military flags were all swept into the storm. The world suddenly became incomparably dark, and they couldn't even see their own fingers in front of them. The once insufferably arrogant snow beast had completely collapsed. The heavy steel puppet was still standing tall, but the stone puppets had all turned into rolling gourds, involuntarily tumbling backwards with the wind. The ice mages were either hiding behind the steel golems, praying in panic, or being swept into the air. Everyone's hearts were filled with despair. They didn't know what was happening in front of them. They only saw a snowy mountain that was emitting a dazzling golden light flying towards them, and then everything became a mess. Only 2 people were able to remain standing in this storm. One was Han Jin, and the other was Adolf. Even Chesam had no choice but to stand up from his chair, because his chair had already been shattered. Although the titans he brought with him could barely control their bodies, they couldn't resist the power of nature as they were constantly being pushed back by the storm. A moment later, the storm had already passed, but it didn't stop. It only blew into the distance, and the surroundings were already a mess. This camp was used to store the golems, and the facilities were somewhat crude. However, it couldn't be considered crude anymore. The camp had almost completely disappeared. The ice mages fell from the sky one after another. The furthest one was actually blown a few thousand meters away. Even the titans had retreated to the foot of the mountain. The banquet that Chesam had set up had all disappeared without a trace. The ice mage who had tried his best to protect the maidservants had a pale face, and his body was on the verge of collapsing. His companions had been swept into the air, and although they were terrified, they were still under a lot of pressure. On the other hand, it was much more difficult for him to withstand the storm while standing still. His mana had already been exhausted. The ice mages lowered their heads, and so did the titans. They wanted to look at Han Jin, but they didn't dare to. They really didn't dare to. Thinking back, Han Jin had only chanted for a few minutes, and he had actually cast a powerful forbidden spell. This was overwhelming power. But was this a forbidden spell? Why had they never heard of it before? More importantly, the snowy mountain had landed in the distance. What would happen if it landed on top of them? Chesam's gaze became extremely sluggish. He looked at the approaching snowy mountain for a moment, then at the original location of the snowy mountain, as if he was looking for something. His forehead and cheeks were covered in brown frost. It was the masterpiece of the spiced duck, but he had forgotten to wipe it off. Sorry. Han Jin shrugged. Han Jin's voice woke Chesam up. He abruptly turned to look at Han Jin. Silver light flickered wildly in his eyes, but no one could tell what he was thinking. I didn't expect it to be like this. Han Jin's apologetic expression was very sincere. With my current ability, I really can't control the power of magic. This is the power of creation. Adolf, who looked like a 10,000-year-old ice sculpture, finally spoke, but his voice had become hoarse. This is the power of creation. 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 Although Adolf was repeating the same sentence, his tone was definitely different. The first sentence was very low, the second sentence was somewhat agitated, and the third sentence was filled with a kind of craziness. The fourth sentence, however, returned to normal, with only a slight tremble. Hearing Adolf's words, Chesam let out a groaning sigh. He looked at Han Jin seriously. At this moment, he wanted to smile at Han Jin, but he couldn't. The power that Han Jin had displayed had completely shattered his confidence. His cold shadow city could withstand the attack of a forbidden spell, but could it withstand the weight of a mountain? Or, which city in the world could remain unscathed under Han Jin's magic attack? This was a world where the strong were respected. If one's power was far inferior to the others, but still wanted to be on the same level as the other, it would only bring disaster to oneself. Han Jin was here to form an alliance with him. If he brought an army to attack Cold Shadow City, just that spell alone would be enough to completely destroy his army. Although Chesam's thoughts and judgments were always abnormal in certain aspects, he still retained a certain level of wisdom when it came to making choices in a clash of power. Did he really have to bow down to this human? Chesam felt very pained. Even the great Titan race had to submit to the control of a human? Right at this moment, Chesam glanced at Adolf out of the corner of his eye, and his heart began to beat wildly once more. That's right, the power of creation. Wasn't it enough to make a revered ascetic willing to become his servant? He had heard the report from the ice mage this morning that Adolf hadn't returned to his room last night, and had stood in front of Han Jin's door for an entire night. Master Raphael, you're not giving me any face at all, Chesam said with a smile. However, his smile was very forced. Forget it, I know you didn't do it on purpose. How about this? Let's go back to Cold Shadow City. Chapter 459. After returning to Cold Shadow City, Chasem found out that Cold Shadow City had also been affected. A few old and simple houses had collapsed, and nearly 100 civilians had been injured by the falling rock. Fortunately, there were only injuries and no death. Most of the flags on the central castle were scattered on the streets or on the roofs of the houses. The tallest and most ostentatious flag, which symbolized Chesem's authority, had also been bent by the storm. From afar, it looked like a person was bowing. What was more interesting was that the person was bowing in the direction of the Holy Crown City in the south. Chasem had no time to comfort the people. Before he could even catch his breath, he immediately ordered a banquet to be held at the top of the central castle. The scale of this banquet was far greater than yesterday's. There were more than 30 titans in attendance, and more than 100 ice mages. It was obvious that this was the core power of Cold Shadow City. Chesem's attitude had also undergone a huge change. Although he was no longer bowing like a slave, his tone was very respectful, and his words were careful. Not only Han Jin, but everyone at the banquet could see that he was trying to flatter Chasem. Han Jin knew that if he had purposely hurt Chesem's pride, the result would not have been so harmonious. Even though Chasem had behaved normally during their interactions, it was impossible for a patient to behave like this all the time. Otherwise, he wouldn't be considered a mental patient, but a lunatic. Guevara and Solomon's assessment of Chasem, the Thunder Titan, was very similar. One person could be wrong, but the possibility of both being wrong was very low. Facts had proven that Han Jin's approach was correct. Lord Raphael, the moment the Abyssal race appeared on the continent, the army of Cold Shadow City will immediately depart and rush to the Holy Crown City to fight alongside you. After chatting for a while, Chasem finally got to the point. This was also the first time he had made a promise to Han Jin in front of everyone. Han Jin pondered for a moment and understood what Chasem meant. If the Abyssal race really launched an invasion, Cold Shadow City would automatically ally with the Holy Crown City. However, if the Abyssal race did not make a move, then don't even think about attacking him. It seemed that Chasem was still wary of him. Power in this world was completely privatized, and no one would willingly give it up. This had nothing to do with strength. Even if Chasem knew that he was no match for the Holy Crown City, he would still fight to the death. Back then, Dismark had been badly battered by Zaganide, but he had still clenched his teeth and held on. Chasem hadn't even used his main forces, but he had still managed to exhaust Malishin of Depew City. However, there had never been any news of Malishin surrendering to anyone. Depew City was his, and unless he died, no one could take it away from him. Everyone's eyes were focused on Han Jin. The news that the Abyssal race was about to launch an invasion had already spread. Although this news was too unbelievable, with Han Jin's status and identity, it was impossible for him to come to Cold Shadow City and spout nonsense. Therefore, most people believed in Han Jin. If all the lords on the continent were as courageous and stylish as Lord Chasem, I can guarantee that the great demon of the Abyss Donald would definitely be defeated by us. Han Jin sighed. As the saying goes, give a plum for a peach. He also flattered Chasem. Chasem laughed loudly. Han Jin's praise made him extremely pleased. If Han Jin was the number one in the world, then he would definitely be number two. Of course, he used to think of himself as the number one in the world, but now, he could only lower his head. Although the Titans had always claimed to be the direct descendants of the Thunder God, where was the Thunder God at this moment? And Han Jin's power of creation had been clearly displayed in front of everyone. In other words, if the Thunder God had also sent down a division, then Chasem might have had the courage to compete with Han Jin. But since there was no news from the great ancestral god, he could only choose to protect himself. Chesam only needed to say a few words in front of Han Jin to immediately stop the war with Depew City. He also sent out a messenger to convey the message of peace to Malishan. In Chesam's words, they would be comrades in arms from now on, and there was no need for them to fight to the death. Chesam's promise was just as effective as a written agreement. In the eyes of the Dark Dragons, the Titans were arrogant to the point of being detestable, but arrogance and shamelessness were two completely different things. If it had been Zagund, Han Jin wouldn't have believed a written agreement, let alone a verbal one. Titans, on the other hand, had always viewed themselves as the purest and noblest race on the continent. It was unlikely that they would go back on their words. Just as they were chatting, a Titan suddenly left his seat and slowly walked towards Han Jin. He was relatively tall among his companions, which meant that his strength was average. His eyebrows and beard were also somewhat white. The lifespan of a Titan was similar to that of an elf, and far longer than that of a human. Judging from his old appearance, he should have lived for at least 700 or 800 years. "My lord." The Titan bent down and offered a glass of wine to Han Jin. His voice trembled slightly as he said, "Thank you, my lord." "Thank me?" Han Jin was stunned. He glanced at Chesam out of the corner of his eye. Damn it. Chesam was talking to the Titan beside him. Those damn silver eyes. It was hard to tell if he was paying attention to them or not. Han Jin could only ask, "Thank me for what?" "Thank you for taking care of Dominique." The Titan's voice became choked. Is she all right?" Han Jin was very surprised. Was this Dominique's father? Or her grandfather? He didn't dare to be arrogant. He hurriedly stood up and offered the glass of wine in his hand. The two glasses of different sizes gently clinked together. Han Jin's respect didn't just stun the Titan in front of him. On the other side, Chesam also forgot to hide his emotions and stared blankly at them. The Titan's face was red. It wasn't clear whether it was out of shame or excitement. After a long while, he barely managed to squeeze out half a sentence. "I don't have the ability to protect her." The Titan couldn't continue. He finished the wine in his glass in one gulp, turned around and walked back to his seat. His back was slightly hunched, and he gave off a dejected feeling. Han Jin wanted to stop the Titan, but after some thought, he closed his mouth. Dominique's family was toasting him in front of everyone. It was probably Chesam's idea. What was he trying to do? Chesam had always avoided talking about the slave merchant group. It was only once that he couldn't help but mention Alexander. Han Jin's control was obviously stronger than Chesam's. He never mentioned the alliance between Chesam and Zagund. Chesam wanted to push Dominique out. Playing the family card? Ridiculous. How could Dominique forgive you for what you've done to her? The image of a young girl sitting on the deck with her knees bent and staring blankly at the starry sky appeared in Han Jin's mind. Most of the time, Dominique would maintain this posture for a long time without moving. Thinking of this, Han Jin's heart couldn't help but ache. That young girl, she must be missing her home a lot, right? No matter how many friends he had, no matter how deep they were, they couldn't completely replace family. At first, Han Jin thought that Chesam's idea was ridiculous, but after thinking deeper, he saw that there was room for negotiation. As long as Chesam showed enough sincerity and treated Dominique's family better, he might be able to resolve the hatred in Dominique's heart. Moreover, Dominique had already stated that if Han Jin really started a war against the Titans, she would definitely return to Cold Shadow City. After all, blood was thicker than water. Han Jin sighed softly. There was nothing he could do about this kind of thing. However, Chesam was letting him off too easily. He had to think of a way to get justice for Dominique. For most people, this banquet wasn't an easy one. Facing a powerhouse with the power to destroy the world, they couldn't relax. It wasn't until dusk when Chesam ordered the banquet to end that they finally let out a sigh of relief. That was because Han Jin was about to leave. Chesam knew that Han Jin had to go back to prepare for the upcoming war, so he couldn't stay for too long. Of course, it was necessary to make him stay. In the end, Chesam led dozens of titans and hundreds of ice mages to escort Han Jin more than 10 miles away from the city. At the beginning of the moonlight, Chesam stood alone at the top of the central castle. The traces of the banquet had already been cleaned up. He looked to the south for a while, then turned to look at the snowy peaks in the north. He grew up in cold Shadow City, so he knew the terrain like the back of his hand. There should be a snowy peak there. Was it really moved to the north? Even now, Chesam still couldn't believe it. After walking for a long time, Han Jin stopped and looked up at the night sky. He slowly said to Adolf, "Sir Adolf, you can go back by yourself. I have some matters to attend to, so I have to go somewhere else." From the beginning of the banquet until now, Adolf had been standing by his side, and had not said a single word. After leaving cold Shadow City, out of consideration for Adolf's habits, he had no choice but to follow him. How long would it take to walk back like this? He finally understood why he had stayed at the snowy peaks for 7 or 8 days before seeing Adolf rush to cold Shadow City to confront Chesam. It turned out that this stubborn monk had walked step by step to get to where he was. "Sir, please allow me to follow in your footsteps." Adolf's eyes were a little panicked. "I don't feel at ease leaving only Gao Bin and Guevara behind. Also, I have a bad feeling." Maybe it was because he really sensed Sunir and Yelena's fear, or maybe it was because of something else, but Han Jin really did have a bad feeling. "Sir Adolf, you must hurry back and protect our home. Tell them to fight for every day or even every hour and do their best to prepare. Treat it as if a world war will break out tomorrow." Home. Adolf was stunned for a moment. No one had ever treated the Holy See as their home. How warm was this description? After a long time, Adolf slowly said, "Sir, I understand." "It's good that you understand." A smile brighter than the moon appeared on Han Jin's face. The change in Adolf's attitude made him realize something, but he wasn't sure yet. Now was a good chance. Han Jin boldly reached out his hand and patted on Adolf's shoulder. Adolf bent down as if it was a conditioned reflex, like a believer receiving a salute in front of a cardinal. Han Jin was overjoyed, but he also knew that he couldn't go too far. He nodded, then rode on a purple light and rose into the sky like a comet. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Whether it was day or night, the flying purple light was always so eye-catching. Therefore, when Han Jin landed near Tiger Stone Castle, Shazos was already waiting there. Seeing Han Jin's expression, Shazos suddenly said, "You've convinced Chesam?" "Yes." "That's really unexpected." Shazos paused, then smiled. "Why do you say that?" "Because Chesam isn't an easy guy to deal with, haha." Shazos laughed. "I remember I told you that before I found you. I first found Chesam and tried to persuade him to cooperate with Dragonfield. Although Chesam was very interested at that time, in the end, I took the initiative to give up. At that time, Chesam was under pressure from the Elven Alliance and the Beastmen, so he should have been sincere about cooperating with you." Han Jin slowly said, "Why did you give up?" "I don't like his boorishness and arrogance, and his nature." "Haha, you've only known him for a short time. If you had stayed in cold Shadow City for more than 10 days, he would have shown his true colors," Shazos said. "All right, it's time to talk about our business. Are you ready?" "There's nothing to prepare. Unless your companion wants to ask me for a gift?" Han Jin pretended to have a headache. "But you said that as long as I went, it would be the greatest sincerity." "Gift." Shazos could obviously tell that Han Jin was joking. He laughed and said, "The Dragon Race's collection is much larger than you think. Do we still need to ask for a gift?" "Please forgive me, I didn't mean to offend you. But I do need a gift," Han Jin said with a smile, but he was laughing on the inside. The Dragon Realm actually invited him. They were digging their own grave. He didn't care about the things that Shazos promised. What he really wanted was a great gift. If he could do it well, he could even destroy Dragon City and the Dragon Realm. Don't worry, you'll definitely be satisfied. So satisfied that Chazos said, as long as you see that stingy bastard Xavier, you won't be able to resist the urge to beat him up. I wonder if Xavier will give me this chance. Can we drag him out of the dragon's den where he hibernates? Chazos said with a smile. He was the one who convinced Nicholas, and now he had convinced Han Jean. He even made an alliance with Grand Duke Solomon. Chazos was full of confidence in the future. The continent would definitely be in the hands of these three powerhouses. Then, Dragon City could disappear, and his prestige in the Dragon Realm could never be replaced. "Oh right, where is the Dragon Realm?" Han Jean asked. "Take a guess." Chazos was in a good mood. He couldn't help but joke with Han Jean. "Overseas?" Han Jean probed. "Overseas is peaceful, but it's not good for us to understand the changes in the continent." Chazos shook his head with a smile. "Where is it?" "The center of the continent, Paradise Lost." Chazos said, "Follow me." Chapter 460. In his human form, Chazos's flying posture was completely different from that of the magicians. When the magicians released the flying spell, they stood in the air, but Chazos kept parallel to the ground. His speed was much faster than that of the magicians. Han Jean, who was following him, could clearly hear the whistling sound caused by Chazos's body breaking through the air. Seeing that Han Jean was still following him, Chazos's speed became faster and faster. The sky had always been the stage for the dragons. No creature could challenge the dragons in this field. As for the angels, although they were stronger than the dragons, they were not creatures. In the hearts of the dragons, they always looked down on the ignorant puppets that did not even know how to reproduce. That's right, puppets! When Chazos became more and more surprised, he found that Han Jean could not keep up with him anymore. The distance between them was more than 100 meters. Chazos laughed in his heart and naturally slowed down. In fact, Han Jean did not use his full strength. So what if he was fast? There was no need. If he and Chazos had a conflict, and Chazos was desperately running away at this moment, he would definitely let Chazos know what a nightmare was. After flying for several days, Chazos did not stop to rest, neither did Han Jean. Chazos was eager to go back to the dragon field and give an explanation, while Han Jean wanted to go back to the Holy Crown City as soon as possible. The dense forest passed under their feet. Han Jean didn't know how far they were from Paradise Lost, but he could see that the vegetation in the forest was getting taller and denser. In the end, they could even see ancient trees that were more than 100 meters tall. In a sense, every ancient tree was a complete world. Countless long vines hung down to the ground from the branches, and the trunks were covered with moss and all kinds of fungi. Countless insects and ants were perseveringly exploring the branches and leaves. Perhaps they wouldn't have the chance to see another ancient tree in their lives. This was their sky, their earth, and their world. The magical beasts here all moved in groups. Han Jean also saw a thrilling scene. A group of thunderbirds fought with griffins. The number of thunderbirds was almost thousands, while the number of griffins was simply incalculable. The thunderbirds had the ability to release magic, while the griffins could only fight in close quarters. However, they were not afraid at all. They surrounded the thunderbirds from all directions, and the two sides fought fiercely. Han Jean was a little hesitant. If he flew in a straight line, it would cause him some trouble if he alarmed the thunderbirds. However, Chazos continued to fly forward as if nothing had happened, and then burst out an earth-shattering roar. The thunderbirds and griffins in the fierce battle immediately scattered. The relatively simple magical beasts could not bear the pressure of the dragon's power. This had nothing to do with the number of companions. They did not dare to challenge the existence at the top of the food chain. Seeing that the battlefield was cleared in the blink of an eye, looking at the large number of thunderbirds and griffins' corpses, Han Jin wanted to fly down and collect the magic crystals. Unfortunately, Shazos was here. He could not be too stingy, so he could only pretend that he did not see. The dragon's power swept across, and the forest became quiet. More than a dozen giant lizards that were lying on the top of the mountain shook their tails and disappeared into the forest. In the distance, a group of unicorns had just walked out of the dense forest. When they heard the dragon's power, they immediately turned around and retreated. Shazos was very satisfied. However, just as he smiled, there was suddenly a fierce roar in front of him, as if responding to the dragon's power. That's Behemoth? Han Jin's vision was very good. Why are there still behemoths? These are all wild behemoths, damn it! Shazos's figure suddenly stopped. He secretly calculated in his heart. When I return to the dragon realm, it's time to teach those lazy bums a lesson. How can they let the behemoth settle down in such a close place? Dozens of creatures that looked like giant apes rushed out in front of him. Each of the behemoths opened their big mouths and roared nonstop. A pair of thick and strong arms were also repeatedly waving. It was obvious that they had issued a challenge to Shazos. Shazos felt a little embarrassed. His eyes turned fierce. He suddenly stretched out his hand, and a long spear that was completely made of flames appeared in his hand. The next moment, he had already thrown the flame spear. During the battle against the Holy See, a flame spear that he had held back was still able to severely injure Adonis. The magic released by the guardian of the dragon realm, Shazos, was definitely not something that wild behemoths could resist. The flame spear flashed through the air. The behemoth that was attacked only had time to raise its foot before the flame spear hit its chest. With a loud bang, a hole as thick as a bucket appeared in the behemoth's chest. From the front of the behemoth, one could see the grass behind it. Its incomparably sturdy chest was actually pierced through in an instant. The flame spear's momentum did not dissipate. It shot into the ground and finally exploded, creating a large hole with a radius of 3 to 4 meters. Han Jin's heart trembled. Shazos's flame spear was incomparably fast. It also contained a huge amount of attack power. Not to mention other things, even if he tied the behemoth in front of him and let him attack at will, he did not dare to guarantee that his way of the heavens would be able to penetrate the behemoth's body. After that battle, he was very clear about how tough the behemoth's body was. He was able to kill so many behemoths completely because of the abnormal Samadhi true fire. If he used the way of the heavens, the effect would definitely be very poor. The behemoth that was attacked slowly fell back. Although it did not bleed much, that was because the flame spear had instantly burned its internal organs. In reality, its life had already been cut off. The other behemoths were stunned for a moment. Then they roared again. A few behemoths picked up boulders from the ground and threw them into the air with all their might. However, they were not as accurate as the mountain giant. Moreover, Shazos was in the air, so the range was far from enough. Not satisfied. Just not satisfied. This was the behemoth's answer. At this moment, dozens of behemoths rushed out of the forest and joined the provocation. Shazos was so angry that his face turned red. As the guardian of the dragon city, he could not even subdue this group of magical beasts. It was really embarrassing. He wanted to stay and kill this group of damned guys, but that would take time. Moreover, if he was angry in front of Han Jin, he would be looked down upon. After hesitating for a moment, he could only give up. Let's go, Lord Raphael. Don't bother with this group of stupid magical beasts. If one were to use a human's profession to describe the behemoths, rascals would be the most suitable. I have nothing. I am not afraid of anything. Even mercenaries who specialized in hunting magical beasts for a living would avoid the behemoths when they saw them. It was not that they were afraid of the behemoth's battle power. They could use their intelligence to fight against brute force. The problem was, what benefits would they get from killing the behemoths? Killing a giant dragon, they did not want anything else. At least they could get a dragon crystal, The behemoths did not even have a magic crystal. Why would they go through so much trouble to kill them? To test their own battle power? Did they have nothing better to do? Only the dragon clan would encircle and annihilate the behemoth repeatedly because their dignity had been violated. The other powerful clans would not start a conflict for no reason. Even the Titan clan, which was extremely arrogant in the eyes of the Black Dragon clan, would choose to back down. Of course, if the behemoth's body contained a natural treasure, the result would be completely different. Perhaps this also showed the fate of the dragon race. Hard but easy to break. Even if their dignity was offended, they would take extreme measures to solve it. If their interests were invaded, what would happen? During the Battle of Cloud Top City, the leader of the Black Dragons, Valentine, angrily rebuked the arrogance of the Titans. He did not hesitate to lead all the Black Dragons and started a super war between the two races. In the end, Cloud Top City was completely destroyed. In the eyes of smart people, it was self-evident who was responsible for this war. The location of the battle was in the Holy Land of the Titans, Cloud Top City. Who was the one who initiated the attack? Valentine claimed that his dignity had been damaged and that the Titans were too arrogant, but his dignity had been preserved only on the premise that the Titans' dignity and interests were trampled on. It meant that the Titans had committed an unpardonable crime if they did not want their dignity to be trampled on. Who was more arrogant than the Titans? The dragon race had always been able to stand above the continent because they had incomparable power. It was also because they had always been very united. However, the war between the Black Dragons and the Gold Dragons caused the dragon race to be divided into two. Then, the Gold Dragons had internal strife, and they were divided into Dragon City and Dragon Territory. Now, Han Jin was an exception. Perhaps the so-called fate was always benevolent. When fate decided something, it would always send all kinds of signs in advance. Of course, it was not very obvious now. Smart people might find a coherent clue from these legends thousands of years later. After flying for a few more hours, the scenery suddenly changed. The towering ancient trees became fewer, and the terrain became flatter. A vast field appeared. At the end of the field, there were 5 towering mountains. They were connected to each other and looked like a 4-leafed flower. The mountain in the middle was the stamen, and the surrounding mountains were the leaves. From this distance, Han Jin could clearly see some small black spots rising and falling between the peaks. He knew that those were the dragon cliffs. Giant dragons liked to sleep, and often slept for months, or even years, or even decades at a time. They hated being disturbed, so they liked to build their nests on cliffs and precipitous cliffs. Shazos and Han Jin flew closer and closer. They discovered that on the mountain in the middle, there was a series of tall palace-like buildings that almost covered the entire mountain. Han Jin smiled. Solomon had once mentioned to him that this was the influence of culture. Although the elves' culture was much older than that of humans, and they had invented their own language, their influence was not as great as that of humans. This was because the elves respected nature, and everything that humans did was to change nature, or even make nature more suitable for their lives. Regardless of whether this was right or wrong, at least for now, humans had shown their value. A giant dragon flew out of his damp and dark nest to visit a friend of a human king. Of course, that was if he could give up his pride and really treat humans as his friends. In the end, he discovered that his friend lived in a tall and clean palace. There was intoxicating wine and gorgeous clothes. The floor was polished until it was as bright as a mirror. The walls were inlaid with countless beautiful ornaments. Even the soup spoons were carved with exquisite patterns. The burning fireplace made the palace as warm as spring. Would the giant dragon not be moved? Would he not be jealous? Even if there was a conflict, the giant dragon would shout, "You stupid, lowly humans." At this time, he would definitely not have enough confidence. Your nest is not even as clean as a human toilet. What part of your nobility is that? The charm of civilization was unstoppable. When the elves were at their strongest, the elven language was the common language of the continent. Now it had changed to the human language. This was enough to prove everything. After the giant dragon evolved, it could naturally master the ultimate transformation technique. However, the ultimate transformation technique could only allow one creature to be chosen. After that, it could no longer be changed. All the giant dragons would choose to become humans. In fact, they could choose to become dwarves, elves, or even titans. Behemoths were definitely excluded. They could choose anything else. Why must they become humans? This was another strong proof. This was because the way of life of humans had become the mainstream of the continent. No matter if they were stronger or weaker than humans, they would always unconsciously move closer to the mainstream. The giant dragons were no exception. After all, this way of life was indeed very comfortable. They also had enough ability to change it. Why should they reject it? Of course, there were always those who were conservative. Those who did not want to change could continue living in the dragon's den. No one interfered. In fact, there was a dispute among the elves back then. Some elves wanted to change, so they came to the plains and founded a new and independent city, Wild Willow City. Some elves strongly opposed learning from humans and preferred to live in the forest. Thus, the Southern Forest Tribe was born. Some elves did not want to learn from humans completely, nor did they want to live in the forest. They found a place where they could enter the forest and interact with humans. They were the Emerald Tribe. Some other elves were saddened by the disintegration of the elves and chose to leave their homeland. Out of sight, out of mind. Blanche was the descendant of this group of elves. Chazos did not stop at all. He continued to fly toward the mountain in front of him. A dozen golden dragons noticed that someone was approaching and flapped their wings to welcome him. Then, they recognized Chazos and immediately retreated. A moment later, Chazos flew to the highest point of the mountain and landed in front of a magnificent building. Han Jin followed closely behind. He retracted his purple light and landed beside Chazos. Chazos waved his hand. A shadow hurriedly came out from a corner door and stood in front of Chazos. Han Jin scanned the shadow. It was a human. However, this was not surprising. The dragons who could live in this palace had all mastered ultimate shape-shifting. They couldn't take care of themselves and needed human servants. "Is Harriet here?" Chazos asked calmly. "Lady Harriet hasn't returned yet," the servant replied in a low voice. Xiazhua let out a long sigh of relief. His face, which had been tense after encountering the group of behemoths, finally showed a smile. "Lord Raphael, come with me." Han Jin nodded and followed behind Chazos. His eyes were never idle. He looked left and right as if he was admiring the scenery of Dragon City. In fact, he was trying hard to find someone. A one-eyed man around 60 years old with one eye blind. That was Nicolay's tragedy, but it would become his comedy. Han Jin was confident. Chapter 462. Walking up the long stairs, there was a palace-shaped building about 20 meters tall in front of them. This palace was not very majestic, but the entire building was deeply embedded in the mountain rock. In other words, it was built by hollowing out the mountain wall. The amount of work required was much larger than a normal palace. However, thinking about the history of the dragon territory, it did not seem surprising. In front of the palace, there were 4 giant pillars that were at the same level as the roof. They were separated on both sides and separated by 3 doors. On both sides were small corner doors, which should be for servants to enter and exit. Of course, Chazos would not take Han Jin through the corner doors. He slowly walked to the light red giant door in the middle and pushed it. The giant door quietly opened. Stepping into the main hall, Han Jin revealed a stunned expression. From the outside, the palace looked very simple, but inside it was completely different. It was truly different from what it looked like. The ceiling, the walls, the circular pillars, the floor, and the carpet were all emitting the brilliance of jewels. Red, blue, green, golden, and mixed colors reflected each other and dazzled one's eyes. It could even be said that there was no place in the entire palace that was clean. Even the 7 chairs in the row above were inlaid with gems. The preferences of the dragon race were undoubtedly revealed in the palace. Han Jin laughed in his heart. It was a typical nouveau riche style among humans. It would only cause ridicule. The next moment, his gaze swept across the chairs above. The number of guardians in the dragon territory had always been a secret. Even Solomon did not know. Now, the secret was revealed in front of him. Chazos saw the chairs above and paused for a moment. Then, he frowned. "Sir, follow me. This is not the place to discuss matters." After saying that, Chazos had already walked to the side door on the left. In fact, this was the place where the guardians of the dragon territory held their meetings. However, Chazos felt that it was a little inappropriate because there was obviously no seat for Han Jin. If he reluctantly found a chair, it would also give off a sense of condescension, interrogation, and inspection. Chazos was worried about angering Han Jin. Including Dragon City and the Dragon Territory, Chazos was the only exception. Of course, Chazos's goal was to use Han Jin, but his strength was that he could express enough respect. The other giant dragons were too lazy to beat around the bush with humans. Because of their pride and disdain, they were used to directly expressing their determination. You have to obey or you will be killed. Knowing when to yield and when to stand tall was a true hero, and Nicholas was definitely worthy of this title. Back then, he had already decided to cooperate with the Dragon Territory to destroy the Holy See that was blocking the way. In the end, he almost fell out with another guardian, Harriet. It was not that he could not yield, but he really could not. Otherwise, his prestige would be greatly damaged. It was only when Chazos rushed over and replaced Harriet that Nicholas took the opportunity to step down. When Han Jin contacted Dragon City's elder Xavier, Xavier knew that Han Jin had already made contact with the Dragon Territory and obtained the incomparably precious Stardust Gold. His tone was still loud and arrogant, and Han Jin also fell out with him on the spot. Only then did Xavier's attitude soften. This was not determined by one's intelligence. It was a habit that had been cultivated for countless years. Humans should be respectful and obedient in front of the dragon race. After passing through the side door, there was a small living room. Han Jin did not understand at first, but later he guessed Chazos's concerns. His gaze toward Chazos's back became gentler, but he still had to achieve his goal. This kind of small favor would not make him compromise on important matters. "Have a seat, Lord Raphael." Chazos casually sat on a chair and pointed to the side. Han Jin sat down and observed the living room. Just like the hall outside, there were bright lights everywhere. Even the bottom of the floor was studded with gems. If an ordinary person was lucky enough to dig out a few gems here and sell them for gold coins, they would not have to worry about money for the rest of their life. "Lord Raphael, you don't have to worry," Chazos said softly. "Actually, you can just chat casually. I dare to protect you. No one here will make things difficult for you." "Thank you for your concern," Han Jin replied slowly. "Why are you being so polite? We are friends, right?" Chazos smiled. "Besides, it will benefit me a lot to continue our cooperation." A moment later, the side door was pushed open again. 3 people of about the same age walked in one after another. The person walking in front was wearing a red robe. His face was thin, and his eyes were a little strange. They emitted a faint golden light. Even when he blinked, the golden light did not disappear, as if there was an invisible golden film in his eyes. The second person was wearing a black robe. He was relatively thin. He had a tall, curved hooked nose and a pair of extremely thin lips. This could be considered a typical mean appearance. The third person was also wearing a black robe, but his face was round and fat. He always had a smile on his mouth, no beard, and half of his eyebrows were white. He did not know if it was a coincidence or not, but Han Jin suddenly thought of a person, Gao Lishur. Of course, the color of their pupils was different. Lord Raphael, let me introduce you. Chazos stood up. This is Lord Wilbur, this is Lord Antoine, this is Lord Contract, and this. I don't need to introduce you, right? The young and promising Lord Raphael. Lord Wilbur, Lord Antoine, Lord Contract, it is an honor to be received by all of you. Han Jin stood up and said in a respectful tone. He was not afraid, but it was not worth it to cause a dispute because of his attitude. Sit down, there is no need to be so polite. Wilbur smiled. Actually, this meeting is not necessary, hee. Lord Raphael, don't misunderstand. We don't have any opinions about you, but we believe in Chazos. He thinks you can be trusted, and that is enough. Han Jin smiled. Although the other party's attitude was very amiable, he still felt a trace of contempt. Whatever Chazos said was good. A human dared to deliberately deceive the dragons? The guardian called Contract looked around. Where's Harriet? Hasn't she been waiting to see Lord Raphael? She heard that Frost Dragon Antoine appeared in Lost Valley, so she rushed over with them. Chazos smiled. Frost Dragon Antoine appeared in Lost Valley? Contract was stunned for a moment, then said with a smile, Chazos, you are in trouble. If Harriet knows that you deliberately deceived her, I didn't lie. Chazos shrugged. You really didn't lie? The guardian called Antoine was stunned. Frost Dragon Antoine really lives in seclusion in Lost Valley? Yes, but… Chazos dragged his voice. But that was more than 70 years ago. I don't know now. You are much better than me in this aspect, really. Contract sighed. It is obviously a lie, but no one can find fault with you. We can't vent our anger even if we want to. That Lord Harriet seems not to be trifled with. Han Jin asked curiously. The four guardians looked at each other, then shook their heads together. Contract coughed dryly. Let's put it this way. Lord Harriet controls half of the power of the Dragon Realm. More than half. Wilbur smiled bitterly. Contract, you forgot about those dragons that have just reached adulthood. Han Jin was stunned. Controlling more than half of the power of the Dragon Realm, didn't that mean that Harriet had supreme influence in the Dragon Realm? However, looking at the expressions of Chazos and the other guardians, they only felt a headache for Harriet, but deep down, they didn't care. It was as if they looked down on Harriet and didn't feel nervous about losing their power at all. Although Harriet is not very powerful and only mastered the ultimate shape-shifting skill a few decades ago, but… Chazos saw that Han Jin was a little confused and explained in a low voice, in your human words, Harriet is a woman. Cough cough. I don't know what method she used to unite most of the women in the Dragon Realm. You should understand that if those young men who have just reached adulthood don't try their best to please Harriet, it will be difficult for them to find a suitable spouse, so… Han Jin didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Feminists of the Dragon Realm? This world is getting more and more interesting, Chazos. I've already met Lord Raphael, and I completely agree to continue working with Lord Raphael. Then, Wilbur's gaze turned to Chazos. Obviously, he had been uninterested in this matter, or perhaps he trusted Chazos very much. The four of us agree. We already have the majority. Harriet can't object anymore, right? Antoine said slowly, but his eyes were a little erratic. He was probably still uncertain. Don't worry, it's over in such a short time. Can you guarantee that Harriet won't find fault? Contract smiled and gave Wilbur an imperceptible look. How about this, it's almost night. I'll arrange for everyone to drink some wine and chat. All right. Wilbur made the final decision. Han Jin had been secretly observing. He found that the guardians were very humanized. They spoke no different from ordinary people. If he hadn't known beforehand, it would have been hard to believe that they were dragons. He had heard Chazos mention before that dragons liked to use ultimate shape-shifting to transform into humans. Part of the reason was to make it easier to travel on the continent. Judging from their age, they should have mastered ultimate shape-shifting a long time ago. It was not surprising that their speech and tone were influenced by humans after walking on the continent for a long time. However, Wilbur's attitude made him very unhappy. He obviously wanted him to leave the dragon realm quickly. His goal hadn't been achieved yet, so how could he leave? The time it took to eat a meal was not enough for him to find an opportunity. What should he do? Although his chances of success were very slim, he still had to try and work hard. Just as his emotions were fluctuating, a few servants walked in one after another. Compared to Cheesem's extravagance, this banquet was very shabby. Of course, a dragon that had lived for thousands of years generally wouldn't waste time on delicious food and wine. They had already tasted enough. The only thing that could attract them was the theme of how to achieve eternity. Chazos slowly picked up a knife and fork, casually picked up a piece of meat, put it in his mouth and said while chewing, "By the way, do you know what gift Dragon City's Xavier gave to Raphael?" "Xavier? What did he give?" Contract asked. "Dragon bloodwood and some alchemy materials." "Ha! That stingy guy, is he coaxing a child?" Antoine laughed. "Yes, Lord Chazos once suggested that I should throw those gifts at Xavier's face." Han Jean smiled. He noticed that Contract was secretly exchanging glances with Wilbur and Antoine, but he pretended not to see anything. At that moment, an old servant with a hunched back walked in with a crystal wine bottle. It seemed that he was struggling. He walked closer and placed the bottle on the carpet bit by bit. Han Jin's gaze swept over the old servant's face, and his heart felt as if it had been struck by lightning. This person, is he really still alive? The main target that he had been trying to find miraculously appeared in front of him. Han Jin couldn't describe his feelings with words. He was grateful for the blessing of fate. Ever since he could remember, he had rarely thanked fate with the attitude of an insignificant person, but now, he really didn't dare to believe it. Fortunately, Han Jin's shrewdness had become very deep. Even though there were stormy waves in his heart, his face still had a sunny smile. His gaze quickly moved away from the old servant, and the table knife he raised was incomparably stable, without any meaningless tremors. "Antoine, Contract, you've all been tricked." Wilbur smiled. "You just mocked Xavier, you can't be as stingy, right?" "Chazos, you actually schemed against us?" Antoine shook his head, then muttered to himself for a moment. With a flip of his wrist, a crystal box appeared in his hand, and he placed it on the table. Chazos smiled and glanced at Han Jin, asking, "What's inside?" "If it's dragon bloodwood, you'd better put it away." "I'm not that stingy." Antoine smiled. "This is the heart of lava. The fire element it contains can't be compared to even the highest level fire element magic crystal. If it's made into a magic staff, it can greatly increase the effect of all fire element magic." "Chazos schemed against us?" "I think it's you and Chazos who schemed against me and Wilbur." Contract's expression changed a bit. If Antoine had taken out the heart of lava, then he couldn't just randomly find something that wasn't inferior to the heart of lava. After a long pause, he took out a pair of gloves and placed it on the table. "Hellfire gloves?" Chazos recognized that item. "Isn't it all because of you?" Contract glared at Chazos, then said to Han Jin, "The Hellfire gloves can release extremely hot hellfire. When fighting with others, you don't even need to attack the enemy. As long as you can rush over, you can burn the surrounding life into charcoal. However, you need to establish a contract with the Hellfire gloves first, otherwise you'll be hurt. The Hellfire gloves are a divine item, so it must be bound by a contract." Chazos looked at Han Jin happily. "Although it's not as powerful as your divine item, it'll still provide you with a lot of help. Contract, I think the worst guy is you." Wilbur's expression was very helpless. Chapter 463. The guardian named Contract shrugged and looked at Webb with a gloating expression. Webb hesitated for a moment, then suddenly said to Han Jin, "I heard that you have an elven fiancé?" "Yes." Although Dragon City and Dragon City were irreconcilable enemies, and the elves stood on Dragon City's side, he had to admit this. Otherwise, not only would he be letting down Sunir and himself, but he would also be looked down upon by others. "This is for you." A green leather armor suddenly appeared in Webb's hand. From its appearance, the leather armor seemed to be woven from leaves and branches. There was nothing special about it, but Han Jin knew that a gift from Webb would definitely not be an ordinary leather armor. "This is the tree elf battle armor," Webb slowly added. "It can make the elves wearing the battle armor disappear into the forest. Even a super powerhouse won't be able to sense any aura. Of course, the user of the battle armor can't attack." "Many thanks, sirs." Han Jin's smile was very sincere. "This isn't fair," Antoine suddenly said. "How is it not fair?" Chazos was stunned. "The gifts we give are all things that we can use ourselves," Antoine said. Antoine said, "To Lord Weber, this battle suit is trash. Other than the elves, other races can't use the tree elf battle suit at all. Don't you think it's too unfair?" "That's right," Contract said with a smile. "Webb, this is your fault. You are the oldest and have collected the most treasures. How can you use trash to brush off Sir Raphael?" Yes. Chazos continued, "Webb, you should add another one. You guys." Webb was so angry that he laughed. He looked at one and then the other. After hesitating for a while, he took out a magic staff and placed it on the table. "This is for your other fiancée, a flying staff. With this staff, she can fly freely without using any magic power, and her flying speed is much faster than normal flying spells." Among the 4 guardians of the Dragon Realm, Wilbur was the most knowledgeable. His gifts might not be as precious as the Heart of Magma and the Hellfire Gloves, but they were all targeted, and Han Jin appreciated them the most. "A few days ago, I was discussing with Lord Raphael how to trick the Thunder Gods all out of Dragon City. The Thunder Gods all is Yelena's weapon, and yours shouldn't count." Shozo laughed. "Wilbur, you have to add another one." "Don't go too far, Chazos." Webb was so angry that his eyes widened. "Chazos, stop while you're ahead. This is already not easy," Deed said with a smile. Han Jin's face showed just the right amount of gratitude. However, he had already noticed some problems. These guardians of the Dragon Field were deliberately trying to create a harmonious atmosphere, but what was their real purpose? The most effective way to win people's hearts was to hold a stick in one hand and a carrot in the other. Now that he had eaten the carrot, it was time to knock the stick down, right? At this time, the one-eyed old servant had already caught his breath. Trembling, he picked up the wine bottle and poured wine for Webb. "Sir Chazos, Sir Harriet won't be coming back today, right?" Han Jin tilted his head and said to Chazos. At the same time, the soul-devouring orb on his sleeve suddenly flashed with a black light. He used the orb to release a secret telepathic spell and sent a short message to the one-eyed old servant. Now, all that was left was to see whether the one-eyed old servant would cooperate or not. Now, Han Jin was only worried that the one-eyed old servant would be too emotional and give himself away, which was why he chose this moment to make contact with him. The one-eyed old servant was pouring wine for Wilbur. Because of the angle, Wilbur, Antoine, and Contractual couldn't see any changes in the servant's expression. Since Shozo's attention was purposely attracted by Han Jin, as long as he didn't overreact, there shouldn't be any problems. "Haha, you're also worried about Harriet?" Chazos laughed. "From what you said, it's so scary. How can I not be worried?" Han Jin sighed softly. The one-eyed old servant had already filled Webb's cup with wine, and then moved to Antoine's side. His movements were very natural, as if he didn't hear anything. Han Jin was a bit hesitant. Was it because it was his first time using this spell and there was something wrong? Or did he remember the spell incorrectly? In the next moment, Han Jin felt a chill at the back of his neck. He understood. What a deep scheming mind. Even he, the instigator, thought that there was something wrong with the spell. Chazos and Webb couldn't see any clues at all. What kind of self-control did one need to be able to do this? Grand Magus, Grand Alchemist Zhenglin. When Solomon mentioned this person, he didn't hesitate to praise him. A genius, a true genius. When it came to magic, Zhenglin wasn't very outstanding, but when it came to alchemy, Zhenglin was unparalleled in the world. Chisholm's Cold Shadow City was also famous for its alchemy. Unfortunately, the power of an entire city couldn't compare to Zhenglin alone. This was enough to prove Zhenglin's amazing talent. Zhenglin was Nicholas's most capable assistant, and had a status that was second only to him. A few years ago, he had successfully created a weapon that could be described as unprecedented in history, the Demon Annihilation Crossbow. In fact, Zhenglin didn't create the Demon Annihilation Crossbow to target any race. The Demon Annihilation Crossbow itself had a wide range of destructive power. It could ignore a warrior's combat aura, ignore a mage's magic defense, and even the proud giant dragons became pitiful little birds in front of the Demon Annihilation Crossbow. Once targeted, there was no way they could escape. It was said that the only time Nicholas lost his composure in his life was when he tested the power of the Demon Annihilation Crossbow. That night, Nicholas was dead drunk. One had to know that he had never touched alcohol before, because he saw the hope of unifying the continent. The creation of the Demon Annihilation Crossbow was the pinnacle of Zhenglin's career. He had created a miracle, but unfortunately, what happened next was a tragedy. After the Dragon Realm learned of the power of the Demon Annihilation Crossbow, they were furious. Even Chazos, who had always been on Nicholas's side, became tough. The 7 Dragon Realm Guardians immediately issued a threat, ordering Nicholas to immediately destroy all the Demon Annihilation Crossbows and destroy the blueprints. They also ordered him to hand Zhenglin over to the Dragon Realm and let him receive the harshest punishment. Otherwise, the Dragon Realm would start an all-out war with the magnificent Light Empire. Nicholas didn't expect the situation to take a turn for the worse. He explained in every possible way that the Demon Annihilation Crossbow was created to deal with the giant dragons of Dragon City, and that he would never raise his weapon against his allies. However, the Dragon Realm didn't listen to Nicholas's explanation, nor would they accept it. In front of the Demon Annihilation Crossbow, the giant dragon's powerful defense was as weak as a piece of paper. If the humans popularized the Demon Annihilation Crossbow, would the giant dragons still have a place to live? Faced with the threat of extinction, the Dragon Realm even prepared to cooperate with Dragon City to besiege the magnificent Light Empire. When Nicholas was forced into a desperate situation, the Holy See was neutral at the time. If Nicholas attacked the Laura Alliance, the Holy See would help the Laura Alliance. If the Laura Alliance attacked the Grand Light Empire, the Holy See would help Nicholas. This was because the Holy See would only have the opportunity to expand its influence if both sides maintained a balance. On the other hand, Dragon City stood on the side of the Laura Alliance, while the Dragon Realm originally supported Nicholas. However, the appearance of the Demon Annihilation Crossbow caused the Dragon Realm to completely change their stance, and it really led to the encirclement of several major forces. The magnificent Light Empire's destruction was imminent. In the end, Nicholas asked the Pope for help. However, when the Demon Annihilation Crossbow was created, the Pope asked Jedis to ask Nicholas for the blueprint, but Nicholas flatly refused. This was understandable. The Demon Annihilation Crossbow was Nicholas's supreme weapon for conquering the continent. How could he give it to someone else? Of course, the Pope's response was also understandable. When I asked you for the blueprint, you refused to give it to me. Now that things have gotten out of hand, you're asking me for help. No way. Moreover, when the Pope asked for the blueprint, it was only because he coveted the power of the demon annihilation crossbow. He didn't expect the dragon race to react so fiercely. Now, even if Nicholas wanted to share it with the Vatican wouldn't want it. The Pope personally wrote a letter to Nicholas. The letter was full of ridicule and mockery, and he even ordered Jedis to return to the unsetting sun mountains. At that time, Nicholas probably still had a lot of hope in his heart. He hoped that Jedis would be the middleman to persuade the Pope to cooperate with the magnificent Light Empire. However, the Vatican's only purpose was to expand as much as possible, and strive to recover their influence at the peak as soon as possible. It was impossible for them to start an all-out war with the dragon race just because of Nicholas. Regardless of whether Jedis helped Nicholas or not, the Vatican wouldn't change their direction. Not to mention Nicholas, even the Pope couldn't do that. Perhaps, at that time, Nicholas had already developed a monstrous hatred. He hated Dragon City, Dragon Domain, Lola, the Holy See, and even the playmate he had grown up with. This made him gnash his teeth in hatred, because in the end, he had lowered his head. Only the first condition was slightly changed. In order to deal with the dragons of Dragon City and the Dragon Knight of Lola's alliance, Nicholas kept a few demon annihilation crossbows and some special crossbow bolts. The other conditions were complied with. Destroying the blueprints and handing over Garrett were actually two different things. Garrett wasn't a fool. When he realized the danger he was in, he had already destroyed all the blueprints one step ahead of Nicholas, leaving only one copy. If you can protect me, then you can also protect the blueprints. If you want to betray me, then you want to secretly keep the blueprints. How is that possible? What was more interesting was that Nicholas had created a trap for himself. Although no one could compare with Garrett's alchemy skills, Nicholas ordered Garrett to ensure the safety of the demon annihilation crossbows and eliminate all possibilities of copying them. The magic circles carved on the crossbows were completely hidden inside the crossbows, and could not be seen even with detection potions. The magic circles had to be kept intact, and if any parts were removed, the magic circles would immediately self-destruct. In other words, Nicholas only had a few demon annihilation crossbows. If one of them was destroyed, there would be one less, and the special crossbow bolts would also be used. As for whether Nicholas had tried to persuade Garrett before handing over Garrett, no one knew. However, if you want to abandon me and ask me to give you all the things that are useful to you, only those great selfless saints could do such a great thing. Or, if you were a martyr who was deliberately brainwashed to ignore human nature, you could also do such a thing without hesitation. However, in this chaotic world, selfless saints could not be found. Not to mention Garrett, who had taken precautions early on. Even the extremely stubborn Adolf would refuse. He was willing to follow in Han Jin's footsteps, but he also had his own selfish motives. If God wanted to abandon him and mercilessly kill his chance to walk towards eternity, would he really not fall? When someone preached that everyone should be selfless, it would only force everyone to learn how to act. Perhaps those who preached selflessness were paving the way for their own selfish desires to be fully satisfied. Han Jin leisurely picked up a slice of meat and put it in his mouth, chewing slowly. The one-eyed old servant had walked around in a circle and was already panting from exhaustion. At this moment, he was pouring wine for Han Jin. Han Jin's face was calm, but the string in his heart was taut, and he was ready to cooperate with Garrett at any time. As if he was exhausted, Garrett's body tilted slightly, and the wine in the bottle spilled onto Han Jin's robe, soaking a large patch. However, Garrett did not turn the bottle around. Instead, he raised the bottom of the bottle higher and higher. Han Jin frowned. He reached out to grab the bottle and turned it to one side. He looked up at Garrett coldly and asked, "What's going on?" "Ha!" Garrett showed a strange smile and asked, "Are you a human?" "Of course. Another cooperator." Garrett sighed slightly, then suddenly opened his mouth, and spat a mouthful of saliva at Han Jin's face. Han Jin raised his left arm in front of his face to block Garrett's spit. The situation was more favorable to him, but the problem was that Garrett's acting was too much. With his reaction speed, it was impossible for him not to avoid a mouthful of saliva. He might be able to hide it now, but sooner or later, he would arouse suspicion. "How dare you!" Wilbur was furious and shouted harshly. "Get out!" Chazos was also very angry. He even put his hand on Han Jin's shoulder, afraid that Han Jin would do something too extreme. Han Jin looked at the saliva on his left arm and suddenly smiled. His smile was very warm and sunny. Chazos was relieved. He hurriedly stood up and wanted to take Garrett out and punish him severely. At least, he had to satisfy Han Jin. As soon as Chazos's hand left Han Jin's shoulder, Han Jin's fist swung out without warning and hit Garrett's chest. Han Jin's fist had completely sunk into Garrett's body. The huge force tore Garrett's body apart. Blood bloomed. The next moment, Garrett flew out like a stone. He hit the wall and rolled on the ground, never to move again. Several gems on the wall were shaken off and fell on Garrett's body. Chazos was dumbfounded. Wilbur and the other guardians also widened their eyes. There was no need for Garrett to appear in this small banquet. They were indeed up to no good. They wanted to use Garrett to intimidate Han Jin. First, they gave Han Jin some treasures. This was a lure. Then, they threw Garrett out and introduced him to his former glory. They also mentioned that Garrett was now living a miserable life as a slave. This was a harmless warning to Han Jin that if he angered them, he would end up like this. However, before they could throw out the stick, Han Jin had already killed Garrett. After a long time, Chi-Chi jumped up and rushed to Garrett's side. He checked Garrett's condition, then turned around and shouted angrily, "Lord Raphael, do you know who he is?" "I don't care who he is." Han Jin replied coldly, "Lords, what is the meaning of this? Did you deliberately let him humiliate me?" To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 464. You. Seeing how stiff Han Jin's words were, Contract's face darkened. "Is he really dead?" Wilbur suddenly asked. "Yes." Contract answered Wilbur, but his gaze was fixed on Han Jin. Among the guardians of the Dragon Field, Contract's appearance was the most peaceful, and could even be described as benevolent. But at this moment, his face darkened and became exceptionally cold. Even the temperature in the air seemed to have dropped. "It's good that he's dead," Wilbur said slowly. "Contract, I wanted to warn you a few years ago. We should have gotten rid of him long ago. If we left him behind, who knows when he would become a disaster." "Wilbur, you're too careful." Contract frowned. "Can't we even control the Dragon Field?" "Lord Raphael, calm down." Chazos smiled bitterly and reached out to press Han Jin's shoulder. "Didn't you hear what that old man said? He said that you are an agreeable person. Haha, he hates you because you are too close to us." Han Jin was shocked. He lowered his head and thought of something. The strength in his heart dissipated, and his straight body became loose. He no longer resisted Chazos and slowly sat back in his chair. Looking at Glin's corpse and then at Chazos, Han Jin's face showed a very complicated expression. He understood that he seemed to have done something wrong, but he didn't want to admit it. He wanted to explain something, but he didn't know how. Han Jin played out these complicated emotions incisively and vividly. "Control the Dragon Field?" Wilbur said softly. "Contract, in fact, the only thing we can really control is ourselves. The more we want to control, the greater the disappointment. I'm not a scholar, and I don't want to discuss this with you." Contract replied indifferently. "You're too impetuous." Wilbur smiled. "If you can't even restrain your own desires, then it's a sad thing." It seemed that Wilbur's temper was very good. He wasn't angry at all. Why would Lost Paradise's magical beasts lower their heads in front of dragon might? That's because this is a world where the strong are respected, Chi-Chi replied. As a member of the dragon clan, it's even more lamentable to lose the will to fight. Enough. That's enough. Chazos finally lost his temper. What are you doing? Do you want Lord Raphael to laugh at us? Han Jin had already noticed something. The guardians of the dragon domain were not united. Perhaps they could maintain the same general principles, but because of their different habits and personalities, their style of doing things was also different. For example, their attitude towards Greenxing. Wilbur's opinion was to kill Greenxing as soon as possible to be at ease, but the contract probably thought that it would be too easy for Greenxing, so he had to play some tricks. In other words, the reason why the contract's attitude had become so cold was because the toy had been destroyed. Our joke was created by your Lord Raphael. The contract didn't give Chazos any face. With that, he turned and left. Antoine didn't say a word, but Han Jin's every move didn't escape his observation. Seeing the contract leave angrily, he finally said, "Lord Raphael, don't mind it. The contract's temper has always been bad. How about this, you guys sit for a while, I'll go and persuade him." The contract didn't go far. He stood in the hall outside, staring at the door in a daze. His expression wasn't as cold as before. Antoine slowly walked behind the contract and said softly, "Contract, you've gone too far. Chazos certainly knows your intentions. He won't blame you, but you. It's not good to treat Wilbur like that. If our thoughts are the same as Wilbur's, I doubt that there will still be dragons in the world thousands of years later. You're thinking too much. No one will give up the pride of the dragon race. Hasn't Wilbur always supported Chazos? This is enough to prove his attitude." Antoine smiled. "Wilbur always said that I'm too ambitious. In the past, I always gave in to him. This time, in front of a human." The contract exhaled and changed the topic. "Do you think there's something wrong with that, Raphael?" "What do you mean?" "He killed Xingling as soon as they met. I keep feeling that there's something wrong." "He's just young and impetuous." Antoine smiled. "If it were you, if a human spat at you, you'd probably destroy the entire city in anger, right? Just young and impetuous." The contract shook his head. "If Raphael apologized to us, I would also suspect him. But he didn't. Did you notice his wonderful expression?" Antoine couldn't help but laugh. Chazos's judgment is correct. Raphael is just a human with some petty smarts. He became a lord in his early 20s. It seems that he hasn't suffered any setbacks. It's understandable that he's young and impetuous. He doesn't even know how to properly handle the relationship with his family. Do you expect him to maintain his poise here? Family? Chazos said that Raphael's parents have long. You mean Solomon? Yes. Antoine nodded. In the beginning, Solomon trusted Raphael very much. But after Raphael gained Solomon's appreciation, he no longer cared about others. Once, Solomon's eldest son, Jared, and a guy named Tony went to find Yelena. They had some verbal conflicts. As a result, Raphael fought, seriously injured Tony, and drove Jared away. This made Solomon very disappointed. Disappointment is only possible when there's hope. The contract paused. Does that mean Solomon really wants to hand over the capital of elements to Raphael? Solomon didn't hide it from Chazos. He did have such an idea, but Raphael's brutality made Solomon change his mind. Antoine said, "Solomon's biggest wish is to let his children live peacefully. Raphael is just a guest, but he can't tolerate Jared. If he really hands over the capital of elements to Raphael, Jared's fate is imaginable. No matter what kind of person Jared is, he is still Solomon's flesh and blood. He has to think about his own son, right? If Raphael knew why Solomon changed his mind, his face would be even more interesting. The contract laughed in a low voice. Then, find a chance to explain to Wilbur. Don't make it too stiff. Antoine changed the topic. I know. The contract nodded. He's the oldest. I know what to do. The two guardians were speechless. After a while, Antoine sighed softly. In the future, you'll have to play the role of a bad guy. Remember, your performance will directly determine how much trust Chazos will receive. Chazos will benefit from this. If Chazos gets it, won't he share it with us? Antoine asked with a smile. If even a friendship of thousands of years couldn't be relied on, then there was really nothing on the continent that could be trusted. I'm really looking forward to that moment. The contract mumbled to himself. What kind of miracle is it? It can let a young man break through the barrier of the superclass and become a demigod in just a few years. If we can get it. If Han Jin heard the conversation between the contract and Antoine, he would definitely be shocked. It turned out that the Dragon Realm didn't just want to use him to control the continent, they also wanted to spy on him. It was completely understandable. A mysterious power that could let an ordinary person break through the barrier of the superclass in just a few years would definitely attract the attention of many factions. However, Han Jin had been growing at a rapid pace. He was already strong enough to protect himself before he attracted the attention of others. Therefore, the Guardians could only suppress their greed in their hearts. What troubled the Guardians the most was Han Jin's two exclusive magic spells. One was Earthmeld and the other was Faked Earthcorp. As a matter of fact, before Han Jin was invited to the Dragon Realm as a guest, the four Guardians had a fierce argument. Chazos and Wilbur wanted to use a soft approach, while the contract and Antoine thought it was a good opportunity to control Han Jin at all costs. However, in the end, the contract and Antoine were persuaded. It was much more difficult to capture Han Jin alive than to kill him. Maxwell, the elder of the Dragon City, had been a lesson for them. They couldn't take the risk. Besides, Chazos had repeatedly said that Han Jin was much stronger now than when he defeated Maxwell. Chazos had stayed on the God of War for a few days. He found that the core members of the Holy Crown City were very confident about the future. The most important reason was that they believed in Han Jin. Han Jin didn't deny that his strength was increasing rapidly every day. Therefore, Han Jin had already shown some of his power. If they couldn't control Han Jin, the Dragon Realm would have a hard time in the future. Since they could become friends with Han Jin, why would they have to be enemies? We are all looking forward to it. Antoine looked sad. If Han Jin had appeared a few hundred years ago, if they could have mastered that kind of power, his wife might not have died of depression. At their level, there was no previous experience for them to learn from, because it was a taboo of the gods. They had thought that this was the end of their road, but Han Jin's growth had ignited their hope. I think the key is on the God of War. Contractual suddenly said. Raphael's God of War? What's wrong with the God of War? Chazos said that besides Raphael, there is also an undead creature called Harley and a servant called Stilberg who can control the God of War. Contractual whispered, if I'm not wrong, they have all inherited the power of Raphael. You don't want to. Antoine was stunned and hurriedly said, Contractual, you can't mess around. We have to listen to Chazos on how to deal with Raphael. I know. Contractual smiled. Otherwise, with my temper, I would have already run to the Holy Crown City. Even if I can't deal with Raphael, I can still capture the servant called Stilberg, right? You want to break into the God of War? There is no need to have a conflict with the God of War. Will they never get off the ship? Contractual's eyes flickered. Contractual, I'm warning you. You can't mess around. Antoine grabbed Contractual's shoulder. We don't understand Raphael's magic system at all. How can you judge that he won't pay attention to Stilberg's safety? I'm just saying, why are you so nervous? Contractual said angrily. A few days ago there was a blackout in the entire city. Fortunately, it was during the day and I was sleeping, so there was no rush. But today, the blackout happened in our area, and it stopped right after I woke up. I heard from the uncles and aunties downstairs that the electric pole fell, and the electricity only came back at 7 p.m. I almost immediately turned on my computer and typed at full speed, but I still couldn't type much. Everyone, please bear with me. In the future, I'll have to think of a way to switch to writing during the day. That way, if there's an accident, there'll be more flexibility. Right now, I'm in such a sorry state. Chapter 465. A dazzling purple light shot out from the dragon realm, leaving a dazzling trail in the air. Chazos stood outside the palace and heaved a sigh of relief when the purple light disappeared in the sky. This young lord was really hot-tempered. He didn't hesitate to turn hostile at all, and even attacked without any warning. Even though he was standing right beside him, he didn't have the time to stop him. In fact, Chazos was also very dissatisfied with Han Jin on this matter. Even if Green was a good-for-nothing, his life should not be decided by Han Jin. This is the Dragon Realm, not your Holy Crown City. At that moment, Chazos could feel that Compact really wanted to kill him. If it was someone else, such as Han Jin, who didn't have that unpredictable magic, not only Compact, but also Antoine would be furious. Chazos knew that Compact and Antoine had always been hardliners. Of course, unlike Harriet, Compact was selective, while Antoine was fierce and unreasonable. The result was that Han Jin walked out of the Dragon Realm safe and sound. Chazos suddenly felt sad for his own reason. Since when did the high and mighty dragon need to suppress his anger? Greedy, irritable, and easily angered, these were the comments that Chazos gave to Han Jin. In the eyes of the guardians of the Dragon Realm such as Chazos, such a person was too easy to make use of. As long as they played some tricks, they could turn this young lord into a sharp blade in the hands of the Dragon Realm, a sharp blade that could pierce into the heart of the Dragon City. Chazos was full of confidence for the future. Although he only stayed on the God of War for a few days, he could see that the relationship between Han Jin and the core experts of the Holy Crown City was very harmonious, which was enough to prove that Han Jin was a person who valued friendship. As long as he carefully protected the budding friendship, sooner or later, he would be qualified to know Han Jin's secret. A faint smile appeared on Xiao's face. He was finally relieved of one of his worries. After flying for more than 100 miles, Han Jin, who was riding the purple light, suddenly stopped. Then he fell straight to the ground and quietly sank into the soil. Asking for a gift was just a cover-up. When Chazos asked him to go to the Dragon Realm, he first thought of the legendary Great Magus and Great Alchemist, Green Zing, who had disappeared from the continent. When Han Jin launched that fierce punch, he didn't really want to destroy Green Zing, but to cut off Green Zing's vitality and make the dragons lose interest in him. He had already used several charms to protect Green Zing's vitality, seal his soul, and leave a mark on Green Zing's body. In case some abnormal giant dragon suddenly wanted to cut Green Zing's body into pieces, at least he sealed Green Zing's soul and had a chance to save him. Of course, Han Jin didn't want this to happen. As the saying goes, love the house and its crow. Green Zing, who was praised by Solomon, made Han Jin curious. In addition to the information about the demon annihilation crossbow, he really wanted to save this legendary genius. After a few hours, Han Jin had already sneaked to his destination. He estimated that it should be late at night. When Harley confirmed that there were no signs of life outside, he quietly floated to the surface. This was a small valley, and there were broken limbs and bones everywhere. Han Jin was already mentally prepared for this scene, but what he didn't expect was that there were too many bones. The entire valley was covered by countless bones. The bones all over the ground seemed to be describing the cruelty inflicted on them. There were bones of humans, bones of various magical beasts, and a lot of garbage. The stench was overwhelming. Green Zeng's body was casually thrown in the middle of the valley. When Han Jin walked to the side, he found that there was a broken bone piercing through Green Zeng's abdomen, and blood was still flowing out. If it was a doctor with modern medical experience, he would immediately determine that this person was not dead. Otherwise, the blood would not be so fresh. Unfortunately, although the dragon race was powerful, they were close to idiots in this aspect. They could only determine whether someone was dead or alive by sensing the breath of life. Han Jin quickly released a charm to seal the wound. After carefully picking up Green Zeng, he saw that several bones under Green Zeng's body were broken, and there were fresh cracks at the stubble. Han Jin couldn't help but frown. It was obvious that Green Zeng was thrown from a high altitude. Fortunately, there were gaps between the bones which cushioned his fall. Han Jin's charm could only preserve Green Zeng's last chance of survival, but it couldn't protect him from death, just like Yelena. However, the old man's luck was really bad. There was a white bone that was sticking up, and coincidentally, it pierced through Green's body. Fortunately, Han came in time. After continuously releasing a few charms, Green Zeng's face was still very pale. Han Jin looked around and whispered, "Harley, go over there and take a look. There are many human servants in the dragon realm. I found that they often run out of the plains. Grab one of them for me. Be careful, don't attract the attention of the giant dragons." The giant dragons brought humans here to serve them. Of course, they would not care about the needs of the humans themselves. Although a magic spell could solve the drinking water problem, Han Jin saw clearly that there were often human servants pushing carts to and fro the valley. Some of the carts were filled with firewood, some with buckets of water, and some with wild fruit. Obviously, the servants not only took care of the giant dragons, but also took care of themselves. The sudden disappearance of a servant should not alert the giant dragons. "Master? Now?" Harley lowered his voice and said, "It's night now." With the growth of his strength, Harley could ignore the dragon's aura. Other than Adolf, he was afraid of almost nothing. Wait until morning." Han Jin paused and said, "I'll take a walk in the forest and see if I can catch a few magical beasts." "Understood, Master." Harley answered and quietly flew towards the Dragon Valley plains. Time flew, and in the blink of an eye, it was morning. Han Jin had already caught 2 flash leopards and casually threw them into the forest near the valley. Flash leopards were 6th-tier magical beasts, but who knew that they were so useless? Han Jin gave them freedom, but they crawled on the ground, motionless, and looked in the direction of the Dragon Valley and whimpered. However, Han Jin did not care whether this explanation was reasonable or not. He still needed a lot of time to make charms. A gust of cold wind blew from afar. If there was another cultivator here, they would definitely jump up and shout, "What kind of monster is this? How dare you come to die?" There were no monsters, but there was an extraordinary undead creature. When the cold wind stopped, a figure appeared out of thin air and fell on the pile of bones. Harley also turned into his skeleton form. Han Jin tilted his head and looked at the servant Harley had brought back. Maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe he had really thought of it, but the prey Harley had chosen was very similar to Garen's. In fact, when Harley had left, Han Jin regretted that he hadn't warned him. If Harley had brought back a burly man, it would have been a headache for him. "Change their clothes, all of them," Han Jin said in a low voice. Although he was a little clumsy, it was undeniable that Harley was very hard-working. After working for about 20 minutes, he finally managed to change their clothes from inside to outside after tearing holes in their short jackets and pants. Han Jin raised his right fist and punched the servant's chest. It was somewhat cruel to sacrifice an innocent person for his own plan. However, Han Jin's blood had turned cold in the past few years. From another point of view, if he wasn't cruel enough and didn't leave a perfect aftermath, which would have exposed his plan to the dragon field, thousands of people would have died in the war. Many of them would have been his friends. He knew what was more important and what was more important. Then, Han Jin picked up the servant and walked to the bone spear. He pressed it down, and the sharp bone spear pierced the servant's body. Han Jin cast a spell, and the talisman that he had prepared in advance slowly fell on the servant's face. Then, the servant's appearance slowly changed until it became green. The talisman would not lose its effect for 3 months. If a giant dragon came to check Green's body, it would at most wonder why it was rotting so slowly. It would not think of anything else. Han Jin carefully looked at the 2 corpses. After confirming that there were no flaws, he glanced at Harley curiously. Isn't it magical? In the past, whenever Harley released a spell that had never been seen before, he would definitely rack his brains to praise it. However, Harley remained silent, so Han Jin felt that it was a little strange. The so-called arrogance and complacency, as well as the inability to listen to honest advice, were often caused by being spoiled by the people around them. Although Han Jin knew that Harley's flattery couldn't be taken seriously, he had already gotten used to it. Master, I can do this too. Harley laughed strangely. Then, the skull began to change. Thin strands of smoke the size of hair floated out from the skull. Furthermore, the skull gradually shrank, and its figure also changed. Sunir. That's right, it was Sunir. However, Sunir's skin was white and smooth, giving people a feeling that it could be broken by the wind. On the other hand, Sunir's entire body was gray. Harley could at most change his appearance, but he could not change his color. Then, Sunir proudly pulled the bowstring in her hand. However, before she could pull the bowstring, a palm thunder had already struck Sunir in the face. Han Jin did not show any mercy, and Sunir was sent flying 50 to 60 meters away. In the next moment, Harley returned to his original form and floated back with his tail between his legs. He understood where he had gone wrong. Turning into Morrison's, Sasu or Leger, no matter who he turned into, he would be able to win Han Jin's smile. However, turning into Sunir, even he felt that he deserved a beating. Han Jin fiercely glared at Harley, and then used a talisman on Green. If he were to travel alone underground, then the Zhen Yuan consumption would be almost negligible. However, if he were to bring another person, then it would be completely different. The consumption would be many times greater, and if he had to travel quickly while bringing another person, then the amount of Zhen Yuan required would be an astronomical figure. However, Han Jin did not care about this at all. With this old man, it was equivalent to obtaining a huge treasure trove. It was worth it no matter how much Zhen Yuan he had to spend. Han Jin quickly traveled underground with Green. After confirming that they were out of the range of the dragon field, Han Jin jumped to the surface. He immediately summoned his flying sword and stepped on it. Then, he turned into a dazzling purple light and broke through the sky. Chapter 466. Moxink had lost a lot of weight. Although the energy-gathering formation could constantly replenish his energy consumption and even improve his physique, it was inevitable that he would be affected by the intense exercise he had done, and he hadn't eaten anything for a long time. His gaze was much sharper than before. There was no one to save him. He could only save himself. At this moment, Morrison's was no longer making meaningless noises like before. He was constantly being injured and recovering. Only those who had experienced it would understand what kind of pain it was. When pain became a habit, it was not only his sword skills that grew, but also his willpower. Morrison's narrowed his eyes and stared coldly at the approaching angel. He pointed the fire dragon sword in his hand towards the angel, as if he was ready to attack at any time. His legs were bent and his back was arched. His body was almost curled into a ball. Morrison's did not move at all. He looked like a statue, but his posture was like a poisonous snake that was about to attack. However, he stopped right before he attacked. In the next moment, Morrison's suddenly changed. In fact, he did not move at all. What changed was his aura. If he was like an arrow that was about to leave the bow, he was now like a pile of loose mud. Morrison slowly turned around. Han Jin was standing quietly in the corner. Harley had returned to his skeleton form and was floating behind Han Jin. There was someone lying at Han Jin's feet. Not bad. You can actually sense me. Han Jin smiled. Raphael. In just an instant, Morrison's eyes were filled with tears. He did not care who was lying at Han Jin's feet. He only cared about Han Jin. You're finally back. Are you kidding me? Han Jin was confused. He then frowned and said, I haven't left yet. What? Morrison's eyes suddenly widened, and his face became extremely pale. In fact, if Han Jin did not appear, Morrison's could still hold on for a long time. When a person could not break free from a predicament, they could often unleash shocking potential. It could also be said that he was holding on with his last breath. When he saw Han Jin's figure, Morrison's immediately relaxed. Now that he knew that Han Jin had not left, he could not regain his willpower. I'm here to bid you farewell, Han Jin said seriously. Morrison's, you have to hold on. Hey! Before Han Jin could finish his sentence, Morrison's eyes had already turned white. Then, he collapsed and fell straight into the bright Milky Way. Han Jin hurriedly walked forward and grabbed Morrison's wrist. After listening carefully for a while, he smiled bitterly. You've gone too far. Haha. Master, I didn't expect Morrison's to be such a coward. He fainted from your joke. Harley laughed strangely, taking pleasure in Morrison's misfortune. You're very brave? Han Jin raised his eyebrows. Of course. Harley replied proudly. If it was someone who understood Han Jin, they would definitely change their attitude. Unfortunately, Harley's brain was slow by half a beat. Heh. Looks like I should find a chance to lock you up with Adolf. Han Jin smiled. Then, he ignored Harley and turned his gaze to the two angels. He slowly asked, Do you have a way to save this person? The two angels floated to Garen's side and quietly observed him. Suddenly, one of the angels said slowly, Salvation. I think. I have a very distant memory. Han Jin sighed and formed a spell. Two talismans turned into white light and shot out, hitting the bodies of the two angels. It was said that angels were born from the aura of the God of Light. Although he could make angels his slaves, he could not completely change them. He should go to the Vatican to think of a way. Those cardinals were not just for show. Moreover, there was Adolf, this perverted existence. The two angels became silent again, as if they had forgotten Han Jin's question. Harley, send Morrison's to his room, Han Jin said. After waiting for a while, he realized that Harley did not respond. He raised his voice again. Harley! Master, don't! Harley suddenly let out a heart-wrenching cry. Han Jin was shocked. He had forgotten the joke just now. Now, he was talking about sending Morrison's back. Don't what? That old monster will kill me. Master, I am your most loyal and obedient Harley. Are you willing to let me die? Harley cried loudly. He was on the verge of breaking down. You just realized? Han Jin's expression was very strange. After a while, he said helplessly, Okay, it was just a joke. I think you are not as good as Morrison's. After all, he endured for so many days. A joke? Harley was stunned. Then, his tears turned into laughter. Of course, it was not obvious from the skull, but the change in his voice was very obvious. I knew it. Master is the most benevolent, the most, stop talking nonsense. Send Morrison's back. Han Jin's expression was somewhat sinister. This is a good idea. If you don't listen to me in the future, I will lock you up with Adolf. Harley felt a chill down his spine. He did not dare to speak anymore. He hurriedly floated to Morrison's, bent down and picked up Morrison's. Then, he floated out of the magic lab. Morrison's had tried to find the exit many times, but he could not find it. Harley could come and go as he pleased. This was the advantage of Taoist magic. Han Jin thought for a moment and decided to let Garen stay in the energy-gathering circle for the time being. He came back secretly because Garen's identity was too important. Besides, Garen's eye was injured because of the failure of the alchemy experiment. If Garen's identity was exposed, the consequences would be unimaginable. Now it was time to go out and meet Shazos. Since he left the god of war, he had spent 7 or 8 days in the snow mountain. Then, he came back to meet Shazos, went to Paradise Lost, and came back again. All in all, it took him more than 20 days. There must have been some changes in the Holy Crown City. At least before he got on the ship, he found that the magic shield of the Holy Crown City had been activated. However, there was no movement outside the city and no traces of fighting. In the corridor, Han Jin saw that every mountain warrior and magician had a tense face. However, after seeing Han Jin, they all breathed a sigh of relief. Their attitude was obvious. The Lord was finally back. On the deck, there were fewer familiar faces. At first glance, he only saw Guevara and Yelena. At the front of the deck, there was an extra thing, which seemed to be a magic array. Yelena was squatting in the center of the array, busy with something. There were also several magicians who he had never seen before. They seemed to be helping Yelena. Guevara was standing beside Yelena, observing the magic array. The magic array was composed of metal engraved with magic runes, forming a circle. Han Jin faintly felt that the magic array was somewhat familiar, but he could not remember where he had seen it. Because of the angle, Guevara saw Han Jin first. His eyes were full of joy. Han Jin hurriedly put his index finger in front of his lips and walked quietly to Yelena. After rescuing Glyn, the god of fate favored him greatly. He got everything he wanted. Therefore, he was in a very good mood, and his behavior was much more lively than before. After looking behind Yelena for a moment, Han Jin felt that the magic array was more and more familiar. Naturally, he became more and more curious. Finally, he could not help but ask, "What are you doing?" As soon as his voice fell, Yelena angrily threw the potion bottle in her hand on the ground and shouted, "Didn't I say? No one is to disturb me. You, Yelena was stunned and suddenly turned her head. When she saw that it was Han Jin, she could not help but cheer. She jumped up and hugged Han Jin's neck with both hands. She said happily, "Raphael, you're back." Yelena used to be an ice beauty, but after deciding her life, she no longer had so many worries and repeatedly exposed her delicate and naive side. "What's with the temper?" Han Jin lovingly stroked Yelena's hair. He could see that Yelena's face was a little haggard, which proved that she had been working hard these days. The few magicians who had never seen them before stood there in a daze, not knowing whether they should disturb Han Jin and Yelena. Yelena also realized that they were in public. She blushed and hurriedly pushed Han Jin away. "What are you doing?" In order to ease Yelena's embarrassment, Han Jin promptly changed the topic. "Guess." Yelena tilted her head proudly. "How am I supposed to guess?" Han Jin wisely admitted defeat. "Yelena is setting up a magic transmission array," Guevara explained with a smile. "Magic transmission array." Han Jin was surprised. He remembered that he had seen it before in isolated Cliff City. In fact, a long time ago, magic transmission arrays were used frequently on the continent. However, after years of chaotic wars, most of the magic transmission arrays were abandoned because of the great danger. If one was teleporting from one city to another and the magic transmission array of the latter was not activated, then even a super-grade master would be disintegrated by the different dimensions. Who would dare to take the risk? "Raphael, don't you find it strange? Where do we get so many magic crystals to set up a magic transmission array?" Yelena said with a smile. Han Jin smiled. So many magic crystals? He was the lord of the Holy Crown City. Not to mention the gains from the war with the orcs, Dismark's collection alone was enough to set up several magic transmission arrays. The question was it necessary? Of course, as the man whom Yelena had entrusted her life to, he had the responsibility to play dumb. Yeah, where did we get so many magic crystals? I'm not telling you. Han Jin was helpless. He looked around and changed the topic again. Where is Dominique? And Cain, Gibran, and the others, where are they? Let's go, Raphael, I'll take you to a place. Guevara said. Where are they? Han Jin asked. You'll know when we get there. Guevara smiled. Yelena, are you coming with us? Han Jin was even more helpless. How could the great Mr. Guevara learn to be mysterious like a little girl? Yes. Yelena nodded. She valued her work very much, so when she was disturbed, she immediately lost her temper. However, when she saw Han Jin, she immediately forgot about her work. It was not hard to imagine what was most important to her. Chapter 467. Han Jin wanted to find an opportunity to tell Guevara about Green, but he didn't expect that Guevara also had something important to tell him. Feeling curious, he followed Guevara and Yelena down the God of War. Although there was enough time on the road, Han Jin kept talking about other things because Yelena was beside him. Of course, Han Jin trusted Yelena completely, but trust didn't mean that he had to tell her all his secrets. Many times, secrets were not good things, as they could increase the psychological burden of people, especially for those who couldn't bear it. Furthermore, Yelena was still lacking in experience, and Green was going to live on the God of War in the future. If Yelena knew his identity, she might reveal some flaws in her words. In this world, there were not many sorcerers who could be admired by Yelena. Solomon was one of them, and Green was another. How could a little girl remain calm in front of her idol? Han Jin hoped that Green would become an invisible person. The so-called invisible meant that everyone could see this old man, but no one paid attention to his existence, just like a drop of water in the ocean. Yelena's attitude was like a wind vane. If someone was respected by her, who could ignore him? On the way, Han Jin briefly explained the process of his alliance with Chaesam. After the introduction, they arrived at the destination. After getting off the car, he saw a huge house in front of him. He couldn't help but be surprised. Why are we here? Han Jin recognized this house. It was originally the headquarters of Morgan and Company, which was also Chi Li's home. Later, it was invaded by Dismark. When he occupied the Holy Crown City, he immediately cleared out this house. This was Chi Li's property, and he wouldn't allow anyone to touch it. In fact, Dismark, who hadn't found the secret treasure, had sold the house to two nobles. Han Jin didn't care about that, nor would he compensate for Dismark. He directly drove them out. Han Jin had always got along well with the nobles in the Holy Crown City, and he rarely had direct conflicts with the local nobles. However, this was just a small wave that disappeared in the blink of an eye. Most of the nobles still supported Han Jin. The reason for the smooth transition of power in the Holy Crown City was that Han Jin respected the vested interests of the local nobles. He only wanted Dismark's part, and the nobles weren't fools. As the saying goes, if you respect me, I'll respect you 10 times over. Seeing that Han Jin didn't intend to rob them, they immediately rushed to show their loyalty and offered generous gifts. In the end, everyone was happy. In this chaotic era, all invasions would lead to disastrous results, but Han Jin's Holy Crown City was an exception. After Chaesam occupied Cumin City, the population of Cumin City plummeted. After Dismark conquered Tiger Stone Castle, all the local nobles disappeared, including Guevara's distant relatives. When Zagund occupied Black Raven City, he didn't even spare a chicken or a dog. Every time Nicholas occupied a city, he would destroy the local power structure and rebuild it. Only Han Jin didn't do anything. This was inseparable from his temperament and pursuit. The other lords all wanted to hold their own cities in their hands, but Han Jin didn't care. The purpose of being a lord was only to cultivate better and faster. It was because of this relaxed attitude that the people in the Holy Crown City forgot about Bismarck in the blink of an eye, and regarded Han Jin as the rightful ruler. If the Holy Crown City was hit by a series of disasters, people would only miss the former lord more. Although the purpose of destroying the local power structure was to make people forget and accept it faster, but more haste, less speed, would lead to the opposite effect. Go in and you will know. Guevara smiled and opened the door. From the outside, the old house of Morgan and Company was very quiet, but after opening the door, it was startling. Inside, there were fully armed soldiers of the Mountain Corps everywhere. Among the several corps in the Holy Crown City, the loyalty of the Mountain Corps was the highest. It could even be said that Han Jin was their religion. If Han Jin said that the church was evil, they would kill the church without hesitation. If Han Jin said that the elves should be destroyed, they would be the first to raise their butcher's knife. If it were any other corps in the Holy Crown City, they would definitely not do this. Seeing Han Jin, Guevara, and the others coming in, several soldiers hurriedly ran back. In less than a minute, Alexander strode out and bowed. "My lord, you are back." "Yes." Han Jin nodded. "Why are you here?" Alexander was about to speak, but Guevara waved his hand. "You can leave now. I will talk to him later." "Yes, Mr. Guevara." Alexander bowed again. Han Jin could not help but squint at Guevara, but he did not say anything. Walking through the front hall, through the middle hall, and along the way, Han Jin did not know how many soldiers of the Mountain Corps they had seen. He even suspected that Guevara had transferred the whole corps here. Finally, Guevara arrived in front of a light green building that was surrounded by people. He smiled and said, "We're here. Come in." Han Jin had just stepped in when his body stopped abruptly. Gibran appeared in front of him and shouted in surprise, "Raphael, when did you come back?" "As soon as I came back, I was dragged here by Guevara." Han Jin glanced around and saw that Dominique, Cain, and Julia were all inside. The strange thing was that only Dominique seemed to be in a better state, but the eyes of Gibran and the others were bloodshot, almost dyeing their eyes red. However, each of them looked more excited than the other, or rather, more excited. It was a very strange sight. Cain and Julia also came to greet them. Dominique stayed where she was, her eyes filled with fear. Han Jin knew that she was worried that he had brought back bad news. If they were going to war with Cold Shadow City, where would Dominique go? At this moment, a weak voice came from behind the screen in the middle of the hall. "Why is no one coming to pick me up? Hurry up! Hogan, come out!" Guevara raised his voice. "No one is coming to pick me up. How am I supposed to get out?" Hogan's voice suddenly became a lot louder. "Coming, coming." Gibran held back his laughter and quickly walked around the screen. A moment later, Hogan, who was covered in mud, staggered out from behind the screen. When he saw Han Jin, he was stunned for a moment, then shouted, "Master, you're back." Yeah, Han Jin was not in the mood to pay attention to Hogan. "Mr. Guevara, what's going on?" "I have good news and bad news. Which one do you want to hear first?" Guevara smiled. A daring person might have some scruples when doing something, but when two daring people got together, the result would not be as simple as adding up. When three daring people got together, there was probably nothing in the world that they did not dare to do. Guevara, Gaobin, and Majordomo Gale. Although the three of them had different styles of doing things, they were all on par in terms of courage. The three of them hit it off immediately, and no matter what, they had to take out all the treasures. They were all top-notch characters on the continent. After the initial panic, everyone quickly calmed down. So what if they were discovered? Sooner or later, they would fight to the death. What was the difference between being one step ahead and being one step behind? Of course, they had to prepare in advance. Gaobin quickly called Lydia and rushed to the treasure room together. The crack leading to the outside world was only so big. Even if the enemy was a clone of a god, they would have to obediently crawl over first. It was certain that with divine archer Gaobin, magic archer Lydia, and Sunir, who had activated God's mark, this crawling journey would be extremely difficult. Moreover, Majordomo Gale had been moving around in the crack, ready to stab them in the back at any time. Guevara mobilized the mountain army. Like Han Jin, he also trusted the honesty and loyalty of these mountain soldiers. He also gathered all the craftsmen in the city and made more than 500 two-wheeled carts in half a day. He selected more than 1,000 soldiers and sent them to the treasure room to transport the magic crystals. Let's hear the bad news first, Han Jin said softly. His personality was to first experience bitterness before sweetness. That way, even in the most difficult time, he would still have hope. Your judgment is not wrong. Guevara's expression became cold and solemn. More than 20 days ago, the army of the Abyss World had already gathered on a plain underground. But for some reason, they have not launched an attack yet. More than 20 days ago? When I just left the Holy Crown City. Han Jin's body suddenly stiffened. Although he had already made a judgment, prediction and reality were two different things. Did it really happen? He was stunned for a moment and hurriedly asked, "Sir, how did you know?" Majordomo Gale happened to find them. What did Majordomo Gale do underground? Han Jin had many questions in his mind. Don't interrupt me. Let me finish. Guevara said. Majordomo Gale could not estimate the strength of the army of the Abyss World, but he saw more than 10 black dragons. Moreover, the commander of this army was, who was it? Han Jin hurriedly asked. His heart was in suspense. Although he knew that Guevara was deliberately keeping him in suspense, he had to follow Guevara's lead. The fallen angel Catherine, Guevara said word by word. Han Jin could not help but let out a long sigh of relief. Fortunately, it was not the Abyss Great Demon Donald. Han Jin had never met either Nicholas or Donald, but he knew that Nicholas and Donald would become his strong rivals in the future. He had always hoped to deal with the majestic light Emperor Nicholas. Nicholas was the destined opponent of Donald. He was just a small lord, not worthy of your favor. Although his judgment was right, his hope had also been realized. Therefore, the joy in his heart was far greater than the worry for the future. Raphael, what's wrong with you? Guevara was stunned. You don't know about the fallen angel Catherine? I know. Han Jin smiled. As one of the 3 giants of the Abyss, the fallen angel, she is much more famous than Donald. Then why did you? Guevara was really surprised that Han Jin could smile, and it was a genuine smile of joy. Han Jin wanted to explain, but when he saw Yelena, Gibran, and the others beside him, he had to remain silent. When he killed the 7 brothers of Whip, he already knew that Donald had the inheritance of the god of death. In the age of gods, the god of death, Hamas, was the most terrifying god of darkness. There was only one god, and this was a war that Donald started wholeheartedly. The fallen angel Catherine was only a supporting role. Her willingness to participate in the war was enough to prove Donald's prestige and power. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.